Chapter 1446. That young man who looked like a son of an aristocratic family, really had a kind of momentum. His master, who was always serious, would only tell him about this mysterious realm with narrowed eyes when he was in the mood to drink some wine. He also said that a fight between masters was similar to the 4 ways of looking, listening, questioning, and feeling the pulse of a master doctor. Watching the rise and fall of a master's momentum was only the first step, and listening to the master's words was the second step. The next step was to report each other's names and backgrounds to determine whether they were going to fight to the death. Finally, they would not fight unless it was absolutely necessary. At that time it would most likely be a miserable ending of life and death. Liu Dai did not take it seriously at first. After staying in the western regions for a long time, he was used to drawing his sword at the slightest disagreement. He was used to assassinations, interceptions, and fights where money could not be escaped. Why would he care about what sect you were from? As long as someone's path to money was blocked, even if you were a king, you would have to suffer a blow. Men and women who made a living in the western regions where no one cared about anything, did not care about life and death. Since they did not even care about life and death, why would they care whether you were a dragon crossing the river or a son of a rich family? If Liu Dai did not cherish the hard-earned martial arts realm and finally had the hope of becoming a grandmaster, he would have recruited dozens of heroes to block the door after today's setback. If he still suffered losses, he would have called the masters on the ranking list in the outer city. If the outer city could not do it, after all, there were the top bodhisattvas in the inner city who cultivated their qi all year round. The western regions had long understood that the western regions belonged to the people of the western regions. Putting internal strife aside, if outsiders wanted to defecate here, no matter how powerful they were in the Central Plains or in Beimang, they would have to pay obediently. Over the past 20 years, Liu Dai had seen a lot of people who had caused a lot of trouble to this big city, and he had even skinned their skin and pulled out their tendons. Just the number of people who died in the hands of him and his brothers were very difficult to deal with. Some died on the belly of a woman, and some were first injured by a knife in a child's sleeve, and then died in a fight with hundreds of people. Liu Dai thought for a moment and finally suppressed the killing intent that rose in his heart. He waved his hand and called for a trustworthy waiter, and asked the kid to inform the manager of the restaurant that the young man in the B&E rooms could not be touched. The 16 or 17-year-old boy who had already killed people rarely saw Master Lu's gloomy face. He did not dare to act rashly and hurriedly ran to pass on the military intelligence, not forgetting to glance back at Master Lu's stalwart back as he walked down the stairs. In the boy's heart, a man who seemed to be sitting among a pile of bones, drinking wine and enjoying beautiful women was the most indomitable hero in the western regions. Other things aside, when Master Lu went to the high-class brothels to drink wine with prostitutes, the seductive women who usually did not even look them in the eye would always give a big discount when they received money from Master Lu. Even if they slept with Master Lu for free, they would not complain. It was said that they would often lie lazily on the bed and say, "Master Lu, come again." This was not a wild guess. Once he was lucky enough to be taken by Master Lu to broaden his horizons. Although he sat outside the elder sister's room for an entire night and did not even dare to touch the small hand of the servant girl who was waiting outside the corridor with him, when Master Lu opened the door at dawn, he heard with his own ears that the elder sister used a tone that could make one's bones melt as she lazily said, "Master Lu, come again." Since then, the boy had been thinking about how to be half as capable as Master Lu in this lifetime before he was willing to close his eyes and die. With more than 100,000 people densely packed together, it would be a big city even in the Central Plains, let alone in the vast western regions that was even more desolate than Beiliang. You can't compare it to Grand Peace City, can you? After Su Fengnian finished his meal, night fell. He leaned on the windowsill and looked at the night view of the city filled with lights. There was no curfew in this city, and all the wealthy families in the western regions were gathered here. It had a natural quality of being free and unfettered. Naturally, Beiliang would not ignore such an important border area. Ever since his master Li Yishan was born, he was not satisfied with being restrained in the 3 provinces of Beiliang. According to the plan at that time, not only the thousands of ambushing soldiers in Mount Qingqing, but also the western regions including the refugees in Liuzhou and even western Shu and Nanzhou, should have become the strategic depth after the smoke of war rose everywhere. In this way, the Beiliang cavalry's unrivaled field battle strength could be fully displayed. Western Shu would provide the infantry, Nanzhao would provide the soldiers, and the western regions together with the 3 provinces of Beiliang would become the strategic depth for the Su family's iron cavalry to gallop. This was the best strategic concept. This was also Su Fengnian's master, Li Yishan, truly full of brilliance. Unfortunately, even though Su Fengnian had successfully intercepted and killed Prince Zhao Kai and that sick tiger at the Battle of Iron Gate Pass, the imperial court was still one step ahead. In the end, Su Fengnian was still unable to help his master fulfill his long-cherished wish. However, Su Fengnian could not be discouraged, nor could he break a broken jar. Therefore, he had Chao Wei's special army that secretly infiltrated the western regions. For this reason, he had paid the price of almost all the 10,000 Yuzhou cavalry being killed at the Battle of Calabash. In contrast, Su Fengnian had Lu Wenbao, the down-and-out scholar whom he had first met on the Spring God Lake and then accepted from the Moe courier station in the capital, lurk in this city. He had even given him the identity of a second-class room owner in Fushui society, who was responsible for the coordination between Beiliang and Chao Wei's cavalry. For the time being, Su Fengnian did not want to meet Lu Wenbao, who had sneaked into the inner city but had not yet gained a firm foothold. Things were different now. According to Fushui society, Su Fengnian's portrait had been placed on many desks all over the world. Su Fengnian smiled and touched his face. The news from Xiangfan City was not good. Xu Xiu, the girl who had left Mount Qingliang, should have turned her act into reality. She had shown signs of opposing Beiliang on the matter of Lu Su. However, she did not dare to openly offend Beiliang. According to the rules, she had to deal with Fushui society every half a month. She was respectful and cautious. The sky was high and the emperor was far away. People's hearts were like ripples in the water. Su Fengnian was not too angry about this. He had no choice. When he was young, he always heard from his mother that the world was not peaceful. It was even more difficult for women to live in peace. Su Fengnian was too lazy to compete with a poor girl from Nanjiang. It was one thing for God, the Zhao family of Liang and Beimang's army to compete with Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian believed that he was not so miserable that he needed to vent his anger on a girl. However, Xu Xiu was one thing. If the Han from Jizhou whom he had supported dared to betray Beiliang, it would cross Beiliang's bottom line. It would be the same as the horse gang leader Song Diao, who secretly contacted Beimang's Taiping Order and Chun Jiebo. Currently, it was difficult for Su Fengnian to do many things as he wished. However, after killing the loyal martyr of Liang who had a dirty background, Su Fengnian did not have the slightest bit of soft-heartedness. At the beginning of the month, a crescent moon hung in the night sky. Su Fengnian could not sleep, so he simply sat on the roof of the restaurant with 2 pots of strong wine. He looked at the center of the inner city. The night scene at Little Nalanda with a prayer wheel at the top of the mountain was particularly splendid. Surrounding this small mountain, there were lanterns and colored banners everywhere. It was a scene of luxury every night. For no reason, Su Fengnian remembered the verbal confrontation with Xie Guanyin that day. This scholar, who was ranked first in the Lan Dynasty Immortal painting, was not someone who only knew how to speak big words. Xie Guanying's words had indeed poked Su Fengnian's heart. That was, after Su Xiao left Liaodong, he had been unhindered for half of his life. His real achievement during the spring and autumn period was that he had smashed the foundation of the powerful clans that, although the country is broken, the family is still there. He had broken the old rule that, in times of peace, the aristocrats and the king ruled the world together. In times of chaos, the king changed but not the head of the family. There were many tragedies in the spring and autumn period, but there were also many inside stories. Su Xiao, who was a pawn of Liang, was able to defeat the great Dechu. How could there not be some unspeakable things involved? At that time, after Su Xiao completed the encirclement and suppression of the Western Wall, how many aristocratic clans shamelessly bet on both sides? Otherwise, how could West Chu suddenly become one of the powerful officials in the imperial court? As for the southern Tang aristocratic clans secretly colluding with Gu Jiantang, the commander-in-chief of Liang's southern expedition, for the sake of their family's continued prosperity, it was even more uncountable. These inside stories that could not see the light of day, the common people who could only drift along with the general trend would never know. Perhaps only hundreds or thousands of years later would this dusty past be brought up by the historians of later generations in the vast literature. The history books of the previous dynasty were always the servant girls and maids of the new dynasty, who could apply rouge and splash dirty water at will. If nothing unexpected happened, Su Fengnian would certainly belong to the latter fate. Su Fengnian did not care, nor did he care whether the history books written in black and red in the history books thousands of years later would go down in infamy or go down in history. It was just like when he told the old stonecutter in the paradise of Lanyu not long ago that he would do his best. Su Fengnian was no longer the incarnation of Zhenwu Great Emperor, nor was he the reincarnation of the Great Qin Dynasty's emperor. He was just Su Zhao's son. The historians of the Central Plains could scold Su Fengnian for being arrogant but incompetent, losing the entrance to the Central Plains in the northwest, but they could not let the history books in just a few decades begin to scold the Su family of Bailiang, who originated from Liaodong as slaves of two surnames. Since Su Xiao was gone, Su Fengnian could not let his father, who could not sleep well when he was alive, sleep well even after he died. In the end, Su Fengnian wanted to fight to the death with Beimang because of this selfishness. He wanted to leave a good reputation for Su Xiao in the history books and accumulate good karma for his parents, eldest sister, second sister, and Huang Manor. Su Fengnian took a sip of wine, raised his sleeve to wipe the corner of his mouth, but did not put it down. He smiled softly and said, "Su Xiao, as a father, you never ask for anything from your children, nor do you think that we have to have great achievements. But I'm a son who has never been filial. In the past I only cared about going against you. I was so stingy that I only called you father a few times, for fear that my mother would be wronged if I called you father. In the future you don't have to worry about it. Of course you can't do anything about it. In the future when people remember you, Su Xiao, and read about our Su family, some people will not follow the trend and sincerely say that the Su family of Liaodong, like a tiger roaring for 100 years, will not fall down even in death." Chapter 1447. A pair of black-clothed masked people with vaguely visible figures were lying on the roof tiles on the other side. They poked their heads out to look at the figure and whispered. One of them took off his headscarf and reached out to fan his sweaty cheeks. He stuck out his tongue and complained with a frown, "Sister, is there something wrong with that guy's head? He's been sitting there in a daze for almost 4 hours. What if he ruins our plan? Should I go and kick him off the roof?" The other head that covered his face shook his head and didn't say anything. "Sister, that wine smells good. There's still half a pot left. I'm really hungry." After the person who spoke received a glare in return, he felt a bit aggrieved. He lowered his voice and muttered, "That old pervert surnamed Dong in the inner city is really a great spy that the northern Mang has placed here. Grandpa Song and Old Master Huang are risking their lives to lure him here. There are already quite a few top-notch experts in charge of the assassination. We are actually just putting on a show. Don't tell me that we really have to go into battle. Old Dong is one of the top 3 masters in the inner city. Even if that old bastard escaped here with a broken arm and a broken leg, he can still kill us with one finger. My good sister, why bother? Even if you want me to die, you should let me walk on the road to hell drunk so that I won't be afraid of Oxhead and Horseface." The other woman was really annoyed by these unlucky words. She took off her headscarf and said angrily, "Why are you cursing yourself? Damn girl, do you have nothing better to do?" The woman who had caused the trouble giggled and stretched out a slender finger to point at the back of the figure. The angry woman hurriedly shut her mouth and looked up with some regret. She was unlucky enough to be involved in this disaster. Most likely it would be difficult for her to see the sun tomorrow. Since she had such leisure time, she could have admired the moon anywhere in this big city. Why did she have to come to the roof of this unscrupulous restaurant to mourn for the passing of the spring and the passing of the autumn? Wasn't it an undeserved disaster? She sighed softly. In this city, if a few nameless pawns died, it would be a pity. No matter how hard-hearted a person was, their heart would have long been broken. Over the years she had seen too many dead people. Even someone as soft-hearted as her was somewhat numb. She turned around and lay quietly on the cold tiles, closing her eyes to rest. It was no wonder that the old man surnamed Dong in the inner city could gather such a large family in just 10 years. He had 500 to 600 elite cavalrymen nicknamed Black Crow who specialized in assassinations in the city. Most of them were the lackeys of the Dong family. It turned out that his real identity was a very important spy leader in Beimang Gusai state. How could Grandpa Song, who had always been a good man, not be so angry that he wanted to kill? Although Grandpa Song regarded the Su family in Bailiang as his enemy, he had always hated the Beimang barbarians. Otherwise he wouldn't have stayed in the western regions back then. Instead, he would have followed a large number of people into Beimang. Uncle Lu and the others often joked that with Grandpa Song's skills and reputation, if he really went to Xijing, he would be a noble in the Yi family. 7 years ago, they were still ignorant little girls. They only knew that Grandpa Song had made a deal with the Dong family's assassins. He had spent all his savings to hire them to go to a place called Qingliang Mountain in Beiliang to kill a young man surnamed Su from the Liang family. Grandpa Song had gone with them at that time, but for some reason he had been quiet for several years after he came back. It was also at that time that the rumor of Old Song, the drunkard in the outer city, spread. Their younger sister always said that her addiction to alcohol and her tolerance for alcohol were because of Grandpa Song's smell of alcohol, not because she was greedy. This time, if Grandpa Song hadn't insisted on going against the Dong family, the giant in the inner city, Uncle Lu and the others wouldn't have been willing to break this peaceful life that they had earned by enduring humiliation and working hard for more than 10 years. No one doubted that the Dong family's assassins were the real assassins in the world. There was once a second-rate assassin of the Dong family who had spent as long as half a year to kill a first-rate master in the outer city who had a personal grudge against him. It was said that the master was almost driven crazy before he died. The Dong family's various ways of training assassins were enough to make an outsider's hair stand on end. The Dong family's assassins also had endless killing methods. The reason for tonight's ending was that an ambitious young man had appeared beside the old thief of the Dong family. She had seen him from afar last year. She couldn't see clearly if he had the horizontal double pupils that Uncle Lu had mentioned. But at first glance, the young man was indeed very elegant. Her twin sister often talked about him. Although she gnashed her teeth like a little tigress who couldn't wait to eat his flesh every time, she and her sister had a telepathic connection. How could she not know the terrible signs that shouldn't have arisen? Which woman in the world would have such a special look in her eyes when a man was mentioned? She suddenly opened her eyes and grasped the long and narrow saber at her waist. She arched her back and was ready to attack. Her sister was only half a beat slower than her. She also grasped the hilt of her sword. When they were young, they looked like they were made from the same mold. When they grew up, it was difficult to distinguish them. Sometimes they could even fool Uncle Lu and the others. However, their temperaments were completely different. She practiced with the saber while her sister practiced with the sword. She liked to be quiet while her sister was active. Therefore, in the path of martial arts, although her sister was more talented, their masters said that she was better at killing enemies. Grandpa Song, who was ranked 6th on the master list in the outer city, and Master Huang, who was ranked 12th on the master list, both said that they were now close to becoming third-grade martial artists. In the future, they would have a chance to become second-grade master. In this city, there was no such thing as third-grade, second-grade, master or great master. Ever since the sisters could remember, they had only regarded this city as a novel encouragement from the elders. She suddenly widened her eyes and almost shed tears. Then a tall figure with sleeves as big as birds' wings moved like lightning. He swept across the roofs with an unstoppable momentum. He paused not far away and knocked down an elder that they were extremely familiar with from the roofs with one move. Then he rushed over and his thunderous laughter rang in their ears. "Drunkard Song, cripple Huang, you dare to assassinate this old man? This old man is the ancestor of the 3,000 assassins on the ground of the western regions. Tonight, this old man will make an exception and not do his old job. He will kill his way here openly so that you brats who don't know the immensity of heaven and earth will know what it means to strike a stone with an egg. By the way, where is the little girl who is known as the twin jade annulus of the western regions hiding? Hurry up and show yourself so that I can teach you that you are still vigorous despite your age. What enemy? After experiencing this old man's meticulous training of women, I will make you call this old man husband, on your own within a month." As the hoarse voice resounded through the night sky, they could clearly hear the tremors of the street caused by the hooves of the armored cavalry. In their field of vision, there were no less than 100 bat-like figures following the burly old man. She clenched the hilt of her saber, her face pale. Didn't Grandpa Song say that tonight's assassination would definitely not alarm the Dong family's assassins and cavalry? Moreover, the inner and outer cities had always minded their own business. The Dong family had clearly crossed the line and broken the rules by mobilizing all of their forces. Weren't they afraid that the intertwined forces in the inner and outer cities would unite and attack them tomorrow? The Dong family, which was a colossus in the outer city, was not even as powerful as the king of Hell Sima and the god of fortune Li, let alone monopolizing the inner city. Even a new force that had recently risen in the inner city showed signs of replacing the Dong family, whose assassin business had been declining in recent years. The burly old man who was rushing over naturally saw an eyesore lying on the roof of the restaurant, pretending to be dead. He couldn't stop laughing. How could there be such an idiot in the world who was waiting to be killed? He didn't stop pouncing forward. He took a step forward and was about to land on the head of the guy who thought he was smart. He was sure to stomp the head into pieces. The black-clothed woman who was holding the saber knew that she couldn't escape death. She didn't know why, but at this critical moment where she couldn't even protect herself, she jumped over the roof ridge and ran along the slanted roof. Just as the old thief of the Dong family was about to step on the stranger's head, she suddenly stopped and grabbed the young drunkard's collar. She suddenly slid backward, causing the tiles on the man's back to clatter. In the night sky, the sound was particularly ear-piercing, especially when she was exhausted and had to stop near the towering roof ridge. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that the guy didn't forget to hold a wine pot in his hand. She couldn't wait to throw this bastard who wanted wine more than his life to that old bastard of the Dong family. Chapter 1448. The old man from the Dong family was not angry at all. If he really wanted to kill that young man, how could that little girl pull a tooth out of the tiger's mouth with her sloppy skills? The old man was in a good mood because he had finally caught the twin jade annulus of the western region. He was happy to play with them for a while longer. Just as many outsiders said, the rules of this city were very strict. Even with the support of Beimang's Shijing, he was only one of the 3 surnames in the inner city. The Sima family of West Chu and the Li family of Southern Tang had always been above his Dong family. However, after tonight the king of Hell Sima Zhen had gone to see the king of Hell. Then it would no longer be a tripartite balance of power, but a confrontation between 2 powers to divide the inner and outer city. As for Drunkard Song and Cripple Huang, they were all small catalysts for this turbulence. They were nothing more than a smokescreen to deceive the Sima family. He had worked cautiously and conscientiously for more than 10 years but still failed to achieve this result. He had to admit that it was all thanks to that young man from Beimang. Whether it was the young man's background or his skills, no matter how many years Dong Tiling had looked down on the heroes of this city, he could only endure his temper and obediently work as an assistant for that person. There was nothing he could do about it. Who told that person to have such a good father? Dong Tiling couldn't possibly go dig his own father out of his coffin and challenge that person, could he? Of course, if that could make him look like that young man, Dong Tiling really didn't mind digging out his old man's bones. He had lived in this city for a long time in the western region. He had long since gotten used to not recognizing anyone. For example, he was now staring at that pair of beautiful women in their prime. Although the old man couldn't tell who was the older sister and who was the younger sister, he knew that it was one of them who had betrayed everyone together with her cultured and refined Uncle Lu. She couldn't be blamed for anything. Who told her to be blind and fall in love with that young and rich man whose father had a seat in the Beimang royal court? She was even more blinded to think that she could fly together with her lover. As for that one surnamed Lu, he was even less of a surprise. 6 years ago he had tactfully sought refuge with the Beimang Zhu Yun. Otherwise, how could Dong Tiling think so highly of him? How could he have shared the bed with so many beautiful courtesans in the inner city as his brother-in-law? The old man's lustful eyes swept over them and he said with a sinister smile, "May I ask which one of you is called Yen Yen?" "Oh right, it's yen as in swallow, not yen as in wild goose. Your lover asked this old man to pass a message to you. He said that he was sorry for your devotion and was too ashamed to see you, so he asked me to serve you and your sister." The old man laughed and said, "Of course," this old man added the second half of the sentence, "but that's what your lover meant." The woman who had already pulled out her long and narrow saber slowly turned her head and stared blankly at her sister who had thrown away the long sword in her hand. Her sister, Yen Yen, was so heartbroken that she couldn't say any harsh words. She could only sob and say, "Why are you so stupid, so stupid?" The old man enjoyed this kind of drama where family members turned against each other. He was really satisfied from head to toe, as if he had enjoyed this pair of twin jade annulus of the West who were like a couple in a painting. Therefore the old man, who was in no hurry to kidnap them, returned to the luxurious mansion in the inner city that was comparable to that of the nobles in the Central Plains. At Dong Tiling's age, his knowledge of the matters between men and women was incomparable to those rash young men. One must know that Dong Tiling claimed to be a land immortal in bed. How many chaste women initially tried to kill themselves and then they wanted to die? In the end, they gave up all their shame and became the plaything of this old man? Yan Yan, who was in a daze, looked at her sister Yan Yan. She actually smiled and shook her head gently. Sister, that won't happen. Wang Lang won't let me down. Wang Lang promised to marry me, and he will find the most outstanding man in the world for you to marry. He also said that he will take us away from this place where people are killed and dying every day. He will take us to see the small bridges and flowing water in Jiangnan, the moonlight in Tai'an City, the sandstorm in western Bailiang region, the tide in Guangling River, the rising sun in Eastern Sea's Martial Emperor City. Sister, I will take you to see him now, okay? He will definitely nod his head. Yan Yan smiled miserably and said with an ice-cold tone, Yan Yan, you are really crazy. You have been crazy ever since you saw that person. Yan Yan's expression was malevolent as she shouted, I didn't. Dong Tiling looked at this scene and was really pleasing to the eyes. He extended his thumb and wiped the corner of his mouth. He squinted his eyes and smiled. Yan Yan or Yan Yan, don't be anxious. I Dong Tiling have plenty of ways to make you happy. The two of you don't have to seek death like this. When the time comes, you will know that there is such a beautiful thing in the world that even the immortals in the heavens would be envious of. You are not even 20 years old yet. This old man likes the new, but he doesn't dislike the old. Ordinary men don't know the taste of a 40-year-old woman, but this old man is willing to endure it. At the very least, you will have more than 20 years of good fortune. At this moment, when one side was extremely happy and the other side was extremely miserable, an extremely untimely and pleasant voice sounded. You are Dong Tiling? Then do you know that there is a woman called Xianyuan Qingfeng in the Central Plains who will come to the western regions to torture and kill you one day? Dong Tiling was stunned for a moment. Although the old man who was an ancestor of killers in the western regions had been secretly paying attention to this young drunkard, after carefully sizing him up and probing his qi, he concluded that this person was just a nobody without the strength to truss a chicken. Otherwise, how could this person be a level 1 expert at such a young age? The majestic city of the western regions under his feet had a long history of more than 200 years after losing the name of the protectorate of the western regions. Not to mention the people who passed by and the monks of Mount Lantuo, the number of martial arts great masters who lived here all year round could be counted with 2 hands. Now they were even rarer. Only Li Kaishan, who was extremely rich in the inner city, was secretly hiding one. According to his speculation, this person should be Zhao Go of Liyang, who was plotting something big in the western regions and didn't hesitate to conceal his identity. If it weren't for this person adding fuel to the fire, the Li family wouldn't have violated the rules and chosen to stand by and watch, allowing the young man from Beimang to help the Dong family deal with the Sima family. Dong Tiling was not a remnant of the Central Plains who closed their doors and pretended to be deaf and mute because of their own reasons, nor was he an ignorant person who had never left the western regions in his life. Dong Tiling had naturally heard of the woman in purple who was in the limelight on Lake Liang. As for why the young man in front of him brought up the real expert, Dong Tiling took it as a childish trick to use the tiger's skin as a banner to scare him, the devil of the western regions who killed people like scything flax. The old man was very patient with the twin jade annulus of the western regions, but the old man who wasn't interested in men had no patience with the handsome drunkard who was about to die. With a strong killing intent, he sneered and said, "What? Are you familiar with the chief of the Wulin Alliance of the Central Plains? Brat, this old man will say it right here. If you are Xianyuan Qingfeng's lover, this old man will make you the most honored guest of the Dong family in the inner city." At this point, the old man's smile didn't fade. Suddenly, he roared, "Unfortunately, you're not." Dong Tiling was the 3rd strongest expert in the inner city and was an invincible existence in the eyes of the people of the western regions. Under his angry roar, the old man's sleeves fluttered, and his qi leaked out madly. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that ordinary people would be torn apart on the spot under his roar. For example, the sisters Yan Yan and Yan Yan were so intimidated that they staggered and their qi and blood surged. The younger sister, who had already lost her soul, was bleeding from her 7 orifices and looked extremely dismal. Yan Yan was slightly better. As if she was facing a great enemy, she had already guarded her mind and was still determined to fight to the death. However, she wasn't having a good time either. She almost couldn't hold the hilt of her sword. Only that young man who popped out of nowhere was still sitting in the seat that Yan Yan had pulled over as if nothing had happened. Dong Tiling was indeed the winner who had stood among piles of corpses countless times. Without any hesitation he charged forward as fast as lightning. Yan Yan grabbed the drunkard's collar again, thinking that she should at least throw him off the roof first. As for whether he would break his legs or be surrounded by the Dong family's assassins, she thought that it would be better than watching him get smashed in the head by old crook Dong. However, what happened next was beyond her imagination. She wasn't able to throw that guy off the restaurant, and Dong Tiling, who was revered by the entire city like an invincible god, ran away after pretending to charge forward, disappearing without a trace in an instant. Did he just run away for no reason? Yan Yan's eyes widened as she looked around. After confirming that Dong Tiling had really disappeared, she still couldn't believe it, just like how her younger sister Yan Yan couldn't believe that her lover would betray her. Although Yan Yan had only seen the sparring between Grandpa Song and Teacher Huang, she had never seen the sparring between real masters. Even if they didn't fight for 800 rounds, they wouldn't be like old thief Dong who would just bluff and run away, right? Su Fengnian, who had been watching with folded arms, stood up with a wine pot in his hand. He looked at his dazed sister and asked, "That lover of yours who made you pledge your life to him, other than his surname being Wang, do you know what his name is?" Yan Yan laughed as if she had lost her mind. "Who do you think you are to know Wang Lang's name?" Su Fengnian didn't seem to make any movements, but this beautiful young woman spun in the air and then fell solidly on the street outside the restaurant. She probably fainted completely and didn't make any more movements. Chapter 1449. Su Fengnian turned his head to look at Yan Yan, who was holding the hilt of her saber and pointing it at him. His eyes were complicated and filled with emotion. For a moment he was speechless. He thought of Murong Wuzhu and Murong Tonghuang, who were in a miserable situation. He also thought of the filthy Xishan crown prince, Su Su, and this old man's son Zhao Dingxiu. Su Fengnian sighed and looked at a roof about half a li away from him. Dong Tiling, who could be considered an ambitious and ruthless person in the western regions, knew the severity of the matter, but he was unwilling to let it go. The old fox, who was extremely sensitive to danger, began to give orders to his trusted subordinates. He probably wanted to test the waters with the Dong family's killers on the roof and the Dong family's elite cavalry on the street. If it weren't for Chao Wei's cavalry, Su Fengnian wouldn't have had much of an impression of this strategic town used by the great Feng Emperor to show off his achievements. He only knew that in the early years, many killers and assassins from Mount Qingliang used this place as a place to rest and catch their breath. As for Xianyuan Qingfeng saying that he wanted to torture and kill the lecherous Dong Tiling, Su Fengnian really wasn't trying to find something to talk about. Back then, that woman hadn't been with him in northern Liang on the surface and had indeed inadvertently mentioned this matter. However, at that time she still had a favor to ask of him, Su Fengnian, and she hadn't become the Wulin Alliance chief. Perhaps at that time, even she didn't dare to believe that she would one day ascend to the great celestial state. His impression of this big city in the western regions under his feet was truly vivid. After Chao Wei's cavalry quietly went to the western regions, especially Lu Wenbao, who was in dire straits in Shangyin Academy and still did not dare to return to his hometown, entered the city. The Wishui society, which used to stay in the outer city, also began to increase its infiltration. Su Fengnian learned some things from the spy on his desk. For example, there were a few orphans of the later Sui royal family hidden here. However, compared to Su Su, the only child of Xishan crown prince, the three siblings' bloodline was much inferior. Even if the remnants of later Sui wanted to start a rebellion, he probably would not have the face to talk about the three children. Although the western regions was big and Chao Wei's cavalry was not eye-catching, Su Fengnian and the Wishui society still did not dare to let their guard down. In order to attract the attention of the western regions, Su Fengnian remotely controlled the western regions to do a series of good shows. First, he let the female bodhisattva, who was dressed in white, return to Mount Lantua with great fanfare. Then he let Lu Wenbao stir up trouble in this city. He even spread the word in the western regions that Wang Xinji's disciple was going to be the king here and build another Wushuang city in the desert. One of the Dong family's assassins swept past the nearby eaves and slashed down without any hesitation. Su Fengnian did not have any intention of shocking everyone here, and he did not want to expose his strength like this. After all, he was going to stay in the city for a long time. Therefore he started to fight with the assassin. Both sides fought very well. After all, it was not easy for him to kill the assassin with one punch. After all, the other assassins of the Dong family were not second-level master like Dong Tiling. When they saw the hope of killing someone, although their intuition told them that it was not that simple, they still rushed forward. Su Fengnian did not reject any of them and killed them one by one. During this period of time, the Dong family's cavalry on the street did not differentiate between friend and foe and shot at the two people on the roof. However, they were all narrowly dodged by a hair's breadth. This scene made Dong Tiling so angry that he almost spat out a few mouthfuls of blood. He had seen many people pretending to be top experts, but where did this cunning bastard who was afraid that others would not know that he was an ordinary expert come from? After losing more than 40 lives, the old man finally felt the pain. He did not want to add more feet to a snake and ruin the great plan that the young man with the surname Wang had personally set up in the western region. He clenched his teeth and gave an order. The Dong family's men who were invincible in the battle tonight immediately retreated. The moment he turned around and rushed towards the inner city with his back facing the roof, he suddenly felt a chill down his spine. The old man seemed to be able to clearly feel the young drunkard's gaze. Dong Tiling was very sure that even if this person was not a first-level expert of the younger generation in Liyang, his cultivation level was definitely not far off. Just when Dong Tiling thought that he was out of danger, someone beside him walked side by side and said to him in the most authentic Gusai Zhou accent, "Pass a message to the master behind you. If he still wants to play, I Taimudi have learned a few new sword techniques in Baoyang." Dong Tiling did not dare to slow down his pace. Fortunately, he did not see that person's figure in the next moment. Yan Yan only felt a blur in front of her eyes. After blinking her eyes, the young man from the outer city, who she thought was a drunkard, was still standing in front of her without moving an inch. Then she saw that person use his hand to wipe his face. In an instant, his face changed into a slightly stiff and old-fashioned one, like a ghost wearing human skin to travel in the world of the living at night. However, as his finger gently brushed across his face, he quickly looked like a living person. Yan Yan was so scared that she took a few steps back. Su Fengnian had learned a little from Xu Xiu's process of making a face. Compared to Xu Xiu's two realms of rooting and enigmatic, it was much worse. However, it was not difficult to fool ordinary people in the night. Su Fengnian did not mind revealing this little bit of his foundation in front of this woman. However, if her sister was present, Su Fengnian would be more careful. He smiled at her as if she had seen a ghost and said softly, "You're just going to let your sister lie on the street like a corpse? I guess you two don't have a safe place to go for the time being. So, you might as well take her back to the roof before the Dong family sends someone to identify me. Since you've risked your life to save me twice, I'll make sure you and your sister are safe before daybreak. As for what you'll do after daybreak, it's up to you whether you want to stay in the city and wait for death, or run for your lives outside the city." The woman carefully looked at Su Fengnian's shadow. It seemed that he was really not a wandering ghost. Only then did she feel relieved. She gently jumped down from the roof and carried her sister back. She sat cross-legged and gently hugged her sister. Slowly, she could not help but bite her lips and sob. Her eyes were originally watery, but at this moment they were even more misty. She not only felt resentment and pain from being betrayed by her close relatives, but also pity and misery for her relatives. Suddenly, she noticed that the strange person was sitting not far away from her, gently sipping his wine. Then, on the street directly facing this restaurant, under the clear moonlight, she saw 7 or 8 extremely valiant squires appear in the distance. They were guarding a young man in brocade clothes and a marten coat like stars surrounding the moon. Yan Yan was furious. She wanted to jump down and kill the devil who caused her sister to fall into the abyss. Compared to the drunkard, who changed his face, the person on the street was more like a malicious ghost in human skin. Su Fengnian said softly, "Lend me your sword." Without waiting for Yan Yan to answer, her sister's sword flew out of its sheath and into the man's hand. He placed the sword across his knees. The man on the street stopped his horse 200 steps away. He raised his head and asked loudly, "Tai Mudu, may I ask what happened to that Mr. Lu Fu?" Su Fengnian did not say anything. He gently grasped the sword hilt. The wind blew across the border town and the whimpering of the horns sounded. The man snorted coldly, turned his horse around and left. Su Fengyan looked at the gradually disappearing figures. He was somewhat surprised. He did not expect to meet an acquaintance here. This was precisely the extravagant youth from northern Mang who casually gave away a 6-snake wall wandering jade pendant, the young talent of the Go Sword School Wang Weishue. However, his other identity was even more worth pondering. He was the only son of northern Mang's Aquarius Province's magistrate Wang Yong. This guy actually came to the western regions to stir up trouble? Su Fengyan's face darkened. If it was said that Wang Weishue was worried about the safety of the seniors from the chess sword and music school, or that he wanted to obtain some unorthodox achievements in the Battle of Liangmang, that was why he stirred up trouble in this city, Su Fengyan wasn't worried about anything. However, if it was said that northern Mang's spies had inadvertently discovered traces of Chao Wei's cavalry, then Su Fengyan could only go against his agreement with Tantai Pingjing. Su Fengyan stretched out his finger and touched the sword. The sword flew back to the sheath beside Yan Yan. He asked softly, "He is the person your sister likes? When did he come to the city?" Yan Yan steadied her mind and tried to make her tone as calm as possible. "The first time I saw him was last spring. As for when he entered the city, I don't know." Su Fengyan breathed a sigh of relief. Things had not reached the worst point. At that time, Chao Wei's cavalry had yet to set out for the western regions. As for whether Wang Weishue, the second generation of the northern Mang with an extremely thick thigh, had sensed the cavalry's movements, he should have also come for the western region's monk soldiers. Su Fengyan was no stranger to Mount Lantua. It was normal for mountains to stand in great numbers there. However, among those withered old monks who had spoken in front of him at that time, there were a few who did not seem to have a Buddhist aura. Instead, they were rather angry. Su Fengyan could personally go to the mountain to draw a big pie for the western regions. Naturally, Beimang could foresee this and secretly undermine him. They could even draw an even bigger pie for Mount Lantua, who didn't know how to raise the price. As long as he could make Bailiang suffer, Beimang would probably be happy to let Mount Lantua wait for the best price. At worst, he could just let this matter drag on. For Beimang, there would be no loss. Otherwise, he could kill Wang Weishue while he was at it and use the excuse of borrowing troops from Mount Lantua to uproot the Dong family. At worst, he could just follow Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had smelled the fishy smell, and have a 1,000-mile battle in the western regions. Su Fengyan closed his eyes and weighed the pros and cons. Yan Yan was silent for a long time. Finally, she asked, "Young master, are you from the Central Plains?" Su Fengyan smiled and said, "My ancestral home is Jinzhou, Liaodong. I am not from the Central Plains." Chapter 1450. Yan Yan was not the kind of woman who was smooth and slick when it came to socializing with people. For a moment, she did not know how to continue the conversation. However, when she thought of the bleak future that would await her and her younger sister after daybreak, she found it difficult to breathe. She only wanted to distract herself and casually talk to the person who had mysteriously appeared here and acted unpredictably. Only by doing so could she not collapse. Su Fengyan looked into the distance and sighed with emotion. He said softly with a bit of self-mockery, "I used to know a woman who left home to wander the Jianghu. Just like you, she also had a chivalrous heart. I once went with her to Beimang and watched her suffer a lot. I even told her some boring truths about fortune and misfortune. She was also stubborn. In the end, I helped her a little, but now I can't be sure if it was a good thing or a bad thing for her." Su Fengyan turned his head and smiled. "Don't worry, I've changed my mind. As long as I'm in the city, you'll be safe. As for the reason, there really is one, and that is this Jianghu. Without true heroines like you, even if there are as many experts as the clouds, how boring would it be?" Then Su Fengyan said bitterly, "There aren't many old people in this Jianghu anymore." Yan Yan stared at him with clear eyes. Su Fengyan suddenly laughed and asked, "What, do you think I'm the same kind of trash as that old pervert Dong? That I'm actually drooling over you sister's beauty? The only difference is that old man likes to use force while I like to play tricks. Fine, I admit that you've seen through me. You've just escaped from the wolf pack and entered the tiger's den. Why are you crying?" Yan Yan smiled sweetly like a pear blossom in the rain. She shook her head and said, "I know that you're not that kind of person." Su Fengyan leaned back and lay down. "Let's talk about the city. You can choose the interesting things to talk about, such as that little rotten Tuo mountain." Her voice became lighter and the sorrow on her face faded a little. It was not the kind of joy that came from seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but the kind of complete acceptance of fate. She knew that the person beside her, whose surname she did not even know, did not have any dirty thoughts. However, she also knew that he was just a passerby in this city, or rather the place where they grew up. However, she still went along with his words. Young master, you may have heard that there is a prayer wheel on the mountain that no one has ever been able to turn, but you may not know that there is actually an old monk at the foot of the mountain who is nicknamed Zen Master Chicken Soup. He is very interesting. He is not from the western regions, but a foreign monk who recites the Zen Dharma of the Central Plains. If someone goes to the cottage to ask about Zen, the old monk will definitely invite them to eat a pot of fragrant chicken soup. He will not drink it himself but watch others drink it. Su Fengnian said softly, in the Central Plains, there is a branch of Zen Buddhism that indeed has this practice of begging the world with alms bowls. They call themselves beggars and only ask for the word, truth. A bowl of rice from 1,000 families, traveling 10,000 miles alone, and in the end this old monk came to the western regions and cooked chicken soup for people to drink? However, I am very curious. Who killed the chicken used to cook the soup? She was stunned for a moment and said helplessly, how would I know? I have never thought about this question. Su Fengnian joked, Miss, you don't seem to have any Buddhist nature. Even if you really meet the monk chicken soup, you will inevitably be called a fool. Perhaps you won't even be able to drink the chicken soup. She was speechless. Su Fengnian smiled and tried to remedy the situation. Then, are there any famous anecdotes that have spread to the outer city where you are? She nodded and said, of course. I heard that many years ago there was a big horse bandit who killed without batting an eyelid. He swaggered into the inner city and drank the old monk's chicken soup. He asked if such a person could also become a Buddha. The old monk said of course as long as he put down the butcher's knife. That horse bandit who started by killing people laughed and said that he never used a knife to kill people because he thought it was troublesome. He always used both hands to kill his enemies. What kind of butcher's knife did he have? Guess what the old monk said? He said, pick up the butcher's knife first and then put it down. Guess what? Many years later, that horse bandit really brought a knife back to the foot of the mountain and threw it away in front of the old monk. He cried and said that he wanted to put it down. Later, that horse bandit who was more than 50 years old picked up the knife again, shaved his head and put it down. From then on, he became a monk by the old monk's side and devoted himself to Buddha. Su Fengnian said softly, he put down this and that, this side and that side, this shore and that shore, this life and that life, he really did put it down. She said in surprise, young master, you really believe in this matter. In fact, even I don't really believe it. That guy who was getting more and more difficult to understand didn't say anything, so she continued, I also heard that the old monk liked to sing a song called Falling Lotus Flower. The song didn't have a name at first, but there were more than 100 lyrics. Half of them were Falling Lotus Flower. That's why the inner and outer cities gave it the name Falling Lotus Flower. Then someone went to drink the chicken soup and asked the old monk if the falling lotus flower had fallen since he had been practicing Zen for decades. The old monk regretfully told the visitor, who seemed to be deliberately making things difficult, that the lotus flower in his heart hadn't fallen, but when it finally fell one day he would be able to practice Zen and then he would no longer cook the chicken soup. The latest interesting news in the outer city was that there was a foreigner who broke into the inner city and reached the foot of the mountain. He didn't drink the chicken soup and only asked the old monk if he was the same as his master, a celestial being in the world. It was very strange. She talked to herself and didn't notice that the young master's face became gloomy and uncertain after hearing the last part. She also didn't notice that there was an empty-handed man on the roof. Su Fengnian sat up and didn't look at the person who abandoned his sword and carried the corpse to a mountain in the western region. That person sneered and said, now I know that you are really smart. My master defeated him and you defeated my master. It should be your turn to be suppressed by the newcomer, so you would rather not be the most powerful person in the world. You simply gave up your own fate and became one of the more stable 4 great grandmasters. Su Fengnian smiled faintly and said, you are wrong about one thing. Back then your master didn't defeat him and I also didn't defeat your master. The two of them just didn't care about the Jianghu they were in or the Jianghu in the eyes of outsiders. The truth is just as you think. Not to mention the level of cultivation just based on the strength of combat power, your master could even fight Ancestor Lu 800 years ago. Even if the 9 people of Wu Ping joined forces to fight, your master could still kill whoever he wanted. This is the true ultimate of martial arts. As for what your master was thinking at that time, you can think about it yourself. When you understand it one day you can take back the Bodhisattva barbarian sword and take revenge on me. One of Wang Xinji's disciples, the dull man martial Emperor Lu Huang, said in a deep voice, I want to take away the child called Yu Dilong. Su Fengnian shook his head and said, even if I am willing he won't go with you. Moreover, instead of relying on others, it's better to rely on yourself. Lu Huang was silent for a moment and said calmly, I can't defeat you. She was pregnant with her sister who had caused a great disaster. She looked coldly at this strange man whose words were sometimes solemn and sometimes frivolous. To her, all men in the world were heartless and could be killed. But when she saw Su Fengnian raise his hand, she immediately shrank her head and hid in her sister's arms. A lover's heartache was heartache. And this bastard slap was heartache. Both were very painful. Su Fengnian sneered. I knew it would be impossible to reason with a woman like you. You only remember to hit but not to remember. But there are also benefits to having no conscience. In the future when you go to Liang Lake, help your sister be more careful. When you're inexperienced, thinking the worst of people isn't a good thing, but it's not a bad thing in the end. The two sisters didn't know what this pale young man with the surname Su did. That unsmiling but dignified middle-aged man came back. Lu Huang frowned. Su Fengnian wasn't polite to him. You groom you, Linya and the others are actually the same as them. When you go out of the city, you can be considered to have truly entered Jianghu. If you stay in that city of Donghai for the rest of your life, it will be difficult for you to have great achievements. If it was any other Jianghu person who said this, Lu Huang, who had already entered the great master realm, would snort disdainfully. Even the other martial arts experts were no exception. But when it came from the mouth of this young man in front of him, even if he was extremely unwilling, Lu Huang had to think deeply. Lu Huang didn't shake his head and nodded. He looked at those pitiful people and took the lead to lightly jump down from the roof, landing on the street without any movement. Yan Yan let go of her sister and deeply bowed to the mysterious young master she met by chance. Her eyes were red and she bit her lips, unable to speak. Yan Yan looked at her sister with a complicated expression and then glanced at the drunkard whose back she only saw last night. She jumped down before her sister and walked to Lu Huang's side and stopped. Unknowingly, the sky was about to brighten. When Yan Yan finally couldn't say anything to say goodbye, she could only turn her head and look at the slender figure who was still standing on the roof. Yan Yan angrily whispered, he looks so mediocre, what's there to look at? Yan Yan didn't pay attention to her sister. After turning her head, she let out a long breath. She didn't know why, but she felt that from today onwards, no matter how far she walked, she wouldn't be able to walk out of that roof. She couldn't help but turn her head again and see that seemingly lonely figure waving at the three of them. Lu Huang slowly walked forward with a straight face. In his mind, a prophecy that the old monk at the foot of the mountain accidentally said appeared. The fierce tiger of Liaodong roared and killed the central plains. The northwest sky wolf lay alone on the big hill. But at that time, the old monk looked at the cold chicken soup in front of Lu Huang and said with a smile that wasn't a smile, sad and happy, it's cold. Lu Huang was really annoyed with the old monk's sticky words and couldn't help but ask, pretending to be mysterious, if it's cold then it's cold. Don't you know how to heat it up? The old monk slapped his thigh and laughed, time and place are not as good as people and, that's right. After Lu Huang left the city, he looked back at the city wall almost at the same time as Yan Yan and Yan Yan. The three of them didn't know that in the city, there was an old monk running around with an alms bowl full of fragrance. He went straight to the restaurant, jumped up and rushed to Su Fengnian. He laughed loudly and asked, Chao Chongqing is not willing to pick it up. Su Fengnian, are you willing to pick it up? For the first time Su Fengnian was a little uneasy. He smiled and asked, can you pick it up? This chicken soup monk who traveled thousands of miles with alms bowls smiled like a senior monk. Instead he looked a little shifty, take it first and then we'll talk? But when Su Fengnian solemnly took the Buddha alms bowl, the old monk suddenly sat down cross-legged, facing the east and back to the west. The old monk put his palms together as if he was free, as if he was seeing Buddha. He lowered his head and said softly, Junior Brother Dragon Tree, the law does not depend on external objects. The law does not depend on words. My lotus flower has fallen. On Little Lalanda Mountain there was no one pushing it. The huge prayer wheel rotated on its own. The goddess on the wall of the wheel swayed and the six-syllable mantra was transmitted over and over again. It resounded throughout the western region and Baoyang. The Buddha said that if the prayer wheel was rotated on the top of the mountain, the surrounding area would be auspicious and perfect. If the monarch rotated the prayer wheel, the people would be able to eliminate karma and get rid of obstacles. The old monk closed his eyes and passed away peacefully. His last words were, "Good." In an instant, the scattered fate between heaven and earth gathered together like rainbows and lotuses blooming in the sky. They all poured into the alms bowl at the same time. Chapter 1452. The six-syllable mantra on the prayer wheel at the top of the mountain was already spreading with great momentum, but it was a pity that ordinary people were unable to see the bigger phenomenon related to the flow of fate with their naked eyes. After the pedestrians near the restaurant were shocked by the sound of the little rotten to a mountain, they even let out some ridiculing laughter after finding it absurd and comical. In their field of vision, an old monk sat on the roof and a young man stood with a single hand holding an alms bowl. They stood and sat for a whole hour. More and more spectators from the outer city who heard the news gathered below the restaurant and rushed over. They pointed and whispered, and many mischievous children mustered up the courage to climb to the roof nearby. Soon a group of elite cavalry from the inner city galloped over, escorting important figures. The cavalry carried swords, bows, and spears, and their mounts were purebred horses from the western regions that far surpassed wild horses in terms of charging power. The cavalry brutally rammed through the crowd, and many innocent spectators who were unable to dodge in time were killed on the spot by the war horses. It was not that there were no people from the outer city who relied on their martial arts to fight in anger after seeing their good friends killed. Even if there were cavalry at the front who knocked them off their horses, the cavalry at the back borrowed the huge inertia of the war horses' charge to ruthlessly stab their bodies with a spear. The iron-headed hardwood spear between the cavalry's hand and the corpse instantly drew a pleasing crescent moon curve, and the corpse was instantly sent flying 2 to 3 feet away. However, the hardwood used to make the shaft of the spear was ultimately not the kind of priceless first-rate wood that could not be bought on the market. Its hardness and toughness were still insufficient to withstand such a degree of impact, and thus it was destroyed. The cavalry seemed to have not had enough. Taking advantage of the situation, he abandoned the spear and switched to a saber. He slightly bent his waist and instead of slashing downwards he seemed to carelessly hold his saber horizontally. Just like that, he spurred his horse towards a man from the outer city who was running wildly. There was no need for him to use any strength. Just by relying on the momentum of the warhorse, the tip of the saber easily drew a deep wound that was more than an inch long on the man's neck. From this detail, it could be seen that these Western region cavalry who were raised by the inner city's influential officials were all experienced soldiers who were very familiar with fighting on the battlefield. Cavalry battles on the battlefield were never a one-time deal. If they wanted to live to the end, they had to know how to use the least amount of strength to achieve the greatest results. The Western region didn't lack good horses, but craftsmen and ironware were scarce. Moreover, the hardwood used to make good spears was strictly restricted by the Baoyang Frontier Army and the Liang Imperial Court, so it was very difficult to obtain. This greatly limited the combat strength of the Western region cavalry. Although they could take a step back and choose the second best option except for the strong who were equipped with fine iron spears, most of the rest were disposable spears. Even if they could be used as throwing spears, it was enough to deal with Jianghu people. Once they were faced with a genuine cavalry army, they would definitely be unable to handle it. As early as 20 years ago there was a bloody lesson. At the end of the spring and autumn period, this city once had a cavalry army of more than 5,000 people. They were invincible in the western region. At that time, a certain ambitious and ruthless overlord in the city had the intention of annexing the 3 towns of Linyao and relying on them as provisions. Then he would point his spear at the cool land and occupy the high ground of the world, coveting the central plains. Unexpectedly, the Su family, who at that time was a feudal vassal of Baoyang, only sent out 3,000 cavalry and almost completely annihilated the 5,000 western region cavalry. Only a few hundred managed to escape, while the other side's casualties were less than 500. Those escapees still had lingering fears and nagged for many years. They all said that the cavalry army of the Su family was really King Iron Cavalry. Those 2,000 cavalry soldiers were actually equipped with armor for both men and horses. Not to mention the men, even the war horses had armor. Moreover, the cavalry army's iron spears were enough to support multiple charges. The so-called iron spears made of ash wood were really too soft in comparison. As a result, over the past 20 years, even after the large families in this city who had too much money and nowhere to spend it had obtained a cavalry army, they only dared to close their doors and make small fuss. They absolutely did not dare to find trouble with the Bailiang Frontier Army. After the Bailiang Frontier Army formed a custom for small groups of cavalry to enter the land of refugees to practice martial arts so that they could become white horse crossbowmen, there were people who led 800 elite cavalry to the present Liuzhou to fish in troubled waters. At the beginning they relied on their advantage in numbers to surround and kill 30 to 40 Bailiang barbarians. However, very soon they suffered a cruel and ruthless retaliation. At that time the commander of the Lai Torch Cavalry, Hu Kuei, who had not yet become the Lingzhou provincial governor, and the deputy general of Hutu City, Lu Jinu, each led 1,000 light cavalry and slaughtered their way into Liuzhou. After slaughtering the 800 cavalry of the western regions, they hung their heads one by one on the tip of their spears and rushed all the way to this city that was 1,000 li away from Liangzhou. The reason many people in the city did not know of this tragedy was because the person who went to Liuzhou on his own initiative to pick a fight had more than 40 clansmen and more than 900 retainers in the city were all wiped out by the other forces in the inner city in one night. He then took his head and went 30 li out of the city to ask for forgiveness from the Bailiang Frontier Army. They originally thought that this action was sincere enough and would be enough to settle the matter peacefully. Unexpectedly, Hu Kuei, who had single-handedly created the Bailiang White Horse Crossbowmen, when the two sides were in a standoff, especially when Lu Jinu had almost agreed to lead the army back to Bailiang, he brazenly launched an attack without any sense of morality. He slaughtered the 3,000 cavalry in the city that the family heads had only pulled out to bolster their courage. If it were not for Lu Jinu charging into the battle formation and intercepting Hu Kuei, who was in the middle of a massacre, perhaps the situation in the city would be completely different right now. Su Fengnian did not pay attention to the spectators on the streets. After carrying the body of the chicken soup monk, he carried the alms bowl with one hand and flew toward the center of the inner city. He then buried the old monk near the hut at the foot of the mountain and placed the Buddha bowl on the grave. Su Fengnian began to wait for the person who was about to arrive. Toba Bodhisattva. In the second year of Xiangfu, at the end of spring when the sun was gradually warming up and causing people to sleep and have heavy thoughts, the capital suddenly held two ceremonies that did not conform to the rules of etiquette. This caused the Ministry of Rites, the Directorate of Rites, the Prefect, the Minister of Rites, and the Divine Palace Supervisor who was in charge of the affairs of the Imperial Ancestral Temple to be in a panic. Everyone was extremely tired. Those who paid attention noticed that other than the heavy-faced head of the Secretariat Qi Yonglong, there was also an unfamiliar youth wearing the clothing of the imperial astronomer. His expression was even more gloomy. After the two heavy ceremonies it was close to dusk. The emperor still did not let go of the group of exhausted central officials. He moved the small court meeting to the military council hall of the Ministry of War of the Six Ministries. The high officials of the two provinces under the Hall of Governmental Affairs and all of the purple-robed officials of the six ministries were not left out. When the emperor and the two elders, Qi Yonglong and Huanwen, entered the hall hand in hand, there was a giant sand table on the main table that covered the lower reaches of the Guangling River. Other than that, there were also dozens of exquisite molds of warships. The young emperor, who walked quickly, did not wait for everyone to bow. He waved his hand to indicate that they were excused and walked straight to the molds. The Minister of War, Liu Baijie, gave a look to Gao Tingshu, the manager of the Wushuan department for purging officials. This second-ranked official, who had become famous after the Ministry of War's observation of politics, quickly moistened his throat. He took 2 steps forward and introduced the comparison of the strength of the two Guangling navy to the emperor. Reporting to your majesty, at this time the Prince of Guangling's navy has 80,000 people. There are 3 types of large-sized warships, Huanglong, Fengyi and Fuyao, totaling 35 ships. There are 7 types of medium-sized warships, including Menggu, Maotu and Xiandeng, totaling 140 ships. There are also 12 types of small-sized ships, Sima boats and scouts, totaling about 400 ships. The West Chu Navy has 56,000 people and around 700 warships. However, there are only 18 large-sized warships and only 70 or so medium-sized warships like Menggu and Maotu. There are even no less than 200 crudely modified fishing boats mixed in. Their military strength is not at an advantage. In addition, the 40,000 Qingzhou Navy is personally led by the King of Jingyan and has begun to move down the river. The Navy vanguard has already successfully controlled the area where the Guangling River and Bailu Lake intersect. Very soon they will be able to surround the West Chu Navy. Chapter 1453. Emperor Zhou Xian did not make a sound. He was not a son of heaven who would slack off in governance. He was very familiar with the Guangling Dao War. Right now there was only one thing that made it difficult for him to choose. Should he let the two navies at the front and back delay the opportunity, and first help the 10,000 tigers and wolves of the southern border cross the Guangling River? Or should he take advantage of the West Chu Navy taking the initiative to fight a decisive battle with the Guangling Navy and have the Qingzhou Navy quickly enter the empty area at the western end of Bailu Lake so that they could fight a more secure pincer battle on the eastern side of Bailu Lake and not fall into a situation where the West Chu Navy would attack them one by one? Of course, as long as the Nanjiang soldiers successfully crossed the Guangling River, Song Li, who had just entered the capital not long ago, had destroyed most of the West Chu soldiers. Then on the land of West Chu the 100,000 elite Nanjiang soldiers would be unstoppable. They even had the hope of surrounding the capital of West Chu. However, from the start the Guangling rebellion was not a battle purely for victory. Once the 100,000 soldiers of Nanjiang surrounded the capital of West Chu without losing a single soldier, then the victory on Bailu Lake would become an unnecessary battle. If Nanjiang only destroyed the country before the court, that was fine. The worst result was that it was far beyond what the court could bear. If the Guangling Navy and the Qingzhou Navy lost to the West Chu Navy personally led by Cao Chongqing, if Xiao Bing, who was a border king like Su Xiao in the past, had ill intentions and disobeyed the situation, then could the southern expedition commander Lu Xingxiang, who only had tens of thousands of men and horses, stop the wolves of Nanjiang that had been in battle for a long time? What was even more terrifying was that the southern border and West Chu were colluding and heading north together. In that case, Li Yang could only have Gu Jiantang divide his troops between the two Liao border armies and head south to protect Greaton City. The northern Mang had never fought smoothly on the two fronts of northern Liang and Yuliang to begin with, and there were also close to 200,000 soldiers stationed outside the two Liao lines of defense. Could it be that he, Zhou Xian, really had to stand on top of Greaton City and see the northern Mang barbarians and the barbarians of the southern border at the same time? However, all these deductions were built on the premise of the worst-case scenario. Therefore Zhou Xian felt some regret in the depths of his heart. Back then he had listened to the opinions of the head of the Secretariat Qi Yanglong and the Minister of War Lu Baijie and refused to send troops to Western Shu. Was it wrong? After all, there were only 10,000 Shu soldiers. Even if Qin Jibao personally led them, how much merit could they take away on the Guangling Road? Could 10,000 people besiege West Chu's capital? Although it was the young emperor's original intention to not have the king of Shu come out of Shu, when the battle situation became muddy, it was hard to avoid some well-hidden anger. Zhou Xian, an emperor who had everything going smoothly, lacked experience in making decisions. After all, he was not as good as the previous emperor and could not be compared to his grandfather who had spent most of his life fighting on horseback. At this time, Zhou Xian found the Tongxi sword Immortal Lu Baijie, who he could not order around as he pleased, more and more of an eyesore. If not for the fact that the two assistant ministers of the Ministry of War, Su Gong and Tang Taizuang, were new faces in Greaton City, Song Li's experience was too shallow, and those old generals with merit had either died in battle or died of old age. The emperor would have had Lu Baijie leave the Ministry of War a long time ago. Yuan Guo was immediately preparing to head to the vassal state to be the new Jidu deputy of the court. Lu Baijie should have been in the ranks, but Qi Yanglong and Tantanan, the two main officials, both expressed their intentions that this matter was inappropriate, which was why it was delayed. Ever since he ascended the throne, Zhou Xian had his own calculations. In his view, the previous emperor should not have followed Yuan Binshi and Zhang Julu's wishes and released Qin Jibao like a tiger back to the mountain. He should have firmly nailed him to the position of Minister of War. At the very most, he would have given him a military achievement in the Guangling battle. Taking a step back, the same tens of thousands of soldiers. The court did not believe that Qin Jibao could contend against the Nanjiang army. Perhaps no one doubted that as long as Qin Jibao remained in the capital as the Minister of War, the Nanjiang army would not have any thoughts of rebellion. It was not that Zhao Xuan did not understand the previous emperor's original intentions in placing Qin Zhibao in western Shu. However, Zhao Xuan was not someone who blindly admired and trusted this adopted son of Su Shao. He had a deep suspicion of this white-clothed military saint. Furthermore, as the new monarch, Zhao Xuan had to admit that the previous emperor and Qin Zhibao had a relationship. Everyone knew that the previous emperor did not have a good impression of all of Beiliang, but he favored Qin Zhibao greatly. Back then he had almost bestowed the title of king of a different surname on that young man before he was even a year old. Later on he even had him replace Gu Jiantang as the Minister of War. In the end he was 10 years late and still let Qin Zhibao become the king of Shu. After Su Zhao's death he became the only remaining king of a different surname. Zhao Xuan, on the other hand, did not have such a relationship between monarch and subject. The only people who had such a relationship with him were people like Qin Wang, Tang Taizuang, and Song Li, who were still a little below the level of top civil and military officials. The emperor was silent for a long time, so the entire hall could only be silent. Gao Tingshu spoke a few thousand words until his mouth was dry and his tongue was dry. He had truly emptied his stomach of the strategic plans he had prepared long ago. He no longer dared to boast and digress in front of the central officials. After carefully glancing at Liu Baijie, who was the backbone of the Ministry of War, he received a look of affirmation. Gao Tingshu thus shut his mouth and did not add to the painting of a snake with feet. The emperor finally broke the silence and said a few words of encouragement and praise to this new official of the Ministry of War who had many stories in the capital. It could be said that this was in the emperor's heart. All of the important officials in the hall smiled as they looked at this handsome young man with the nickname of Tian Jade Tree. Only the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, Jean Lanting, had a hidden and complicated gaze. The emperor then left the Zhejian and went to the new location of the Hanlin Academy, which was neighbors to the two yamens of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Today there was a tea party in the Hanlin Academy. As expected, the emperor saw Qin Wang, Sun Yin, Yan Qiji, Fan Zhongho, Li Jifu and Song Kelly. Of course, there were more than these 6 people in the courtyard. There were dozens of young and old men in the Hanlin Academy, but no matter how they gathered together, they still could not be seen by the emperor at a glance. At this time the arrogant scholar Sun Yin was discussing a game with Fan Sherdwan, Fan Zhongho. Qin Wang and the top scholar Li Jifu stood side by side on one side, whispering to each other. The current dynasty's uncle-in-law Yan Qiji and the young phoenix of the Song family Song Kelly, who had made a comeback, stood together on the other side. The emperor walked over to take a look. In the end he saw that there were a few rare books placed near the chest jars in Sun Yin and Fan Zhongho's hands. Sun Yin's hands were slightly higher with 4 books, while Fan Zhongho's hands only had 2 books. It seemed that they were betting on chess. After seeing the emperor's arrival, not to mention the other men in the courtyard who were in fear and trepidation, these 6 people's expressions were more or less the same. There were some small differences. Sun Yin didn't move at all. He only focused on the chess game. Fan Zhongho also didn't get up. This new young man, who had originally raised his arm and was pondering, slowly put down the chess piece between his fingers to show his respect. Yan Qiji and Song Kelly both made way. Especially Yan Qiji, who had the most right to be indifferent, his expression was the most serious and respectful. His expression seemed to be even more forceful than Song Kelly's. Qin Wang walked forward in small steps. After taking 2 steps he found that Li Jifu didn't move. He quietly reached out and tugged on the top scholar's sleeve. Li Jifu gave him a grateful glance. The 2 of them came to the front of the emperor. Qin Wang smiled and explained to the emperor, "It was agreed a few days ago that Yue Tian would let Sun Yin play 2 pieces. Including them, a total of 6 people would use 3 months' salary to buy books from Gu Fang Zhongho to bet." Speaking of this, Qin Wang's smile grew wider. This idea was proposed by Sun Yin. It's obvious that he wants to cheat me. Who doesn't know that my salary is the most out of the 6 of them? Then Qin Wang moved slightly to make Li Jifu more eye-catching in front of the emperor. He joked, "Li Jifu has always sent his salary back to his hometown. At most he would have some loose change left. Thus this time he bought the books on credit with me. When he placed the bet he was the most unhappy. He was worried for a long time, afraid that after the end of the year with great difficulty he would owe someone a butt of debt again. Your Majesty, this humble subject has a presumptuous request. If Li Jifu and I lose, can your Majesty help us make up for it?" Your Majesty's family is so big that this humble subject in Li Jifu can't compare to it. Chapter 1454. The emperor smiled and said, "What's so difficult about that? But then again, I have a large family business, but is your father-in-law Chen Xiaobao's family business small? Over the past 6 months, Prince Chai has been making a lot of money every day, making me want to take advantage of him. So I'll help Li Jifu pay off his debt." "Sure, I'll help you, but don't even think about it." Li Jifu was sandwiched between the monarch and his official. In that instant, all sorts of feelings welled up in his heart. He envied the emperor's unique trust in Chen Xiaobao. Otherwise, he would not have bluntly exposed Prince Chai's wantonly amassing of wealth. However, Li Jifu's heart was filled with gratitude for Qin Wang's secret support. After the emperor asked about the bet, he took off a jade pendant from his waist and pulled out the rare Gufang Zhai book that Li Jifu had bet on next to Sun Yin's hand. He handed it back to the Zhuangyun. After Li Jifu took the book, his eyes reddened for no reason. Holding the book with both hands, he quickly lowered his head, his eyes moist. The emperor patted this young subject who had the best ranking in the imperial examination, but whose reputation was at the bottom, and comforted him. "You haven't lost yet, have you?" But in the end, Qin Wang, Li Jifu, Yan Qiji and Song Kelly were the losers. Sun Yin, who had lost, and Fan Zhongho, who had won, not only took back their own books, they also divided up the 3 books from the 4 people before them and the priceless jade pendant. Sun Yin took 2 rare books first, and Fan Zhongho could only take 1 book in the jade pendant. Seeing this scene, the emperor didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "It's fine if Yue Tian bet on himself winning, but Sun Yin, so you bet on yourself losing?" Sun Yin smiled faintly. "Playing chess and betting are 2 different things." The emperor looked at the number 1 chess master of the dynasty, Fan Zhongho, and said helplessly, "The dignified Fan Sherdan is willing to negotiate with this scoundrel?" Fan Zhongho stood up and smiled. "Your Majesty, the 2 sides are actually equal in strength, and the outcome will depend on the will of the heavens." The emperor joked, "Everyone says that when you, Fan Yuetian, play chess, you seem to have the help of a celestial being behind you. So, in the future when you play chess with Sun Yin, you must bring me along. I will bet on one of the books in the 6 libraries." Dusk gradually approached. Under the emperor's personal instructions, the eunuchs brought in many jars of fine wine from the palace. However, the emperor called for Qin Wang, Sun Yin and his brother-in-law Yan Qiji. The 4 of them walked out of the noisy courtyard together. The emperor turned his head to Sun Yin, who had lost the game but won the prize, and casually asked, "I only heard that there was a note. Why did you let me start?" Sun Yin replied, "No matter how many posts I post, I can't beat Fan Zhongho. If the disparity is too great, there's no point in betting." The emperor nodded and said, "Alcohol tolerance, chess ability, poetry and taste are 3 things. After reaching a certain level, to take another step forward is as difficult as ascending to the heavens. It can be said that it was determined in one's previous life, and is not something that can be increased or decreased by human strength." Qin Wang said in a soft voice, "This is just like the Guangling Road War. If the West Chu evildoers did not place 2 or 3 pieces on the chessboard first, no one would have personally gone up or placed a bet." The emperor sighed and said somewhat helplessly, "The reason I pulled you 2 along is because you, Qin Wang, have always been optimistic about the Guangling War, while Sun Yin is the complete opposite. Today I want to hear your inner thoughts. You 2 speak. No matter how shocking your words are, I will calm my heart and think carefully. The quarrels in the imperial court are inevitably mixed in with all kinds of related interests, but you 2 are not the same." Sun Yin glanced at Qin Wang. The latter gently extended his hand, indicating for Sun Yin to speak first. Sun Yin did not hold back. With a kind of boldness he said, "Your Majesty is worried that after the Nanjiang army crosses the river and encircles West Chu's capital, it will become too big to be shaken. Even if it doesn't rebel, it will be enough to raise the price and demand an exorbitant price from the imperial court, to the point of becoming a second Beiliang frontier army, right? Furthermore, the same structure, different situation. Back in Beiliang, Su Shao, for whatever reason, did not divide the river to rule. However, the Prince of Yanqi Zhaobing has painstakingly operated in Nanjiang for more than a decade. Whether or not he will make a different choice, who knows? Your Majesty doesn't want to give the initiative to others and give it to the illusory human heart and the will of heaven, right?" The emperor hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Sun Yin smiled. "There are 3 ways to break the situation. First, your majesty needs to publicly disapprove of the Ministry of War's muddle-headedness and be furious. You need to have the current Minister of War, Liu Baijie, resign and leave the capital to serve as the Jidushi of Nanjiang or Guangling. In short, you need to be able to see the deputy commander of the Nanjiang army, Wu Zhongshuan. You need to move him emotionally, reason with him and promise him benefits. As for the two things, Sun Yin doesn't need to say much. Presumably, with Tongshi Sword Immortal's grace and cultivation, she is more than qualified. However, the word benefits will require your majesty to cut your flesh. The pain is not something a jade pendant on your waist can compare to. The emperor frowned. Is a Jidushi enough? Sun Yin boldly sneered. The emperor said softly, promise that Wu Zhongshuan will enter the capital and become the Minister of War in the future? Sun Yin laughed coldly. The emperor asked, is my Liang going to have another prince with a different surname? Sun Yin asked back, why not? How can the future prince with a different surname be mentioned in the same breath as the Prince of Liang and Prince of Shu? How can the imperial court not be able to handle him? Wu Zhongshuan is already 60 years old, his 3 sons are mediocre and unaccomplished. How many years can he, Wu Zhongshuan, be the vassal prince? The emperor nodded but did not say anything. Sun Yin continued. Secondly, after Liu Baijie stepped down as the Minister of War, allow the Prince of Shu to take 10,000 elite troops out of the country. Moreover, issue an imperial decree to take the title of Minister of War and rush to Guangling Road to quell the rebellion. It is possible to allow Qin Jibao to give half of the Qingzhou navy under the command of the king of Jing'an Zhao Sun to him. Qin Jibao cannot wield great power, but at the same time he cannot not wield it. If his military power is too heavy, it will be difficult to suppress his ambition. If he does not wield the least bit of military power, he will be resentful and have the intention to rebel. The number of troops given to Qin Jibao is 30 to 40,000, but it cannot exceed 50,000. Just because the imperial court does not allow him to leave Shu, does he really think that Qin Jibao can only train 10,000 troops? It is better to let the water out than to block it. The late emperor and Liang have already done a good deed by allowing him to go to western Shu. Beimang's million-strong army is pressuring Beiliang's western front. Thus, it is time to move Qin Jibao back under the nose of the capital. This time the emperor grunted in agreement. Sun Yin took a deep breath. Lastly, it is to let Beiliang go all out and fight Beimang to the death. Not only must the imperial court release Guangling's water transport, but they must also stop the changing of titles. Moreover, they must have Gu Jiantang and Jizhou on the eastern front send troops to suppress Beimang's front lines and drive the wolf to swallow the tiger. In this way, no matter how bad the Guangling Road War is, it will only be a small matter of winning or losing. In the end, Liang will be able to clean up the mess. At that time, Beimang will at most have half of its national strength left, and West Chu will be even more dilapidated and spent. Cao Chongqing will only be asking for death. The young emperor muttered to himself and looked at Qin Wang. The latter smiled bitterly and said, I have nothing to say. Sun Yin waited for the emperor to continue, but he did not get the answer he wanted. He chuckled and said, I'm going back to drink. If I pass out in the Hanlin Academy, I'll have to trouble Qin Shaobao to drag me back. The emperor looked at the back of this arrogant scholar and said softly, Qin Wang Qiji, I'll take you to a place to meet someone. This time the emperor did not even have any guards accompanying him. Only Song Tonglu, the head of the ceremony directorate, carefully led the way. After many twists and turns, they arrived at a secluded courtyard at the edge of the palace. After pushing open the courtyard door, Qin Wang and Yan Qiji saw an unfamiliar man and woman sitting on 2 rattan chairs. The man seemed to be blind and the woman was reading a book to him. Even though Qin Wang and Yan Qiji were close to the emperor, they were still left at the courtyard door with Song Tonglu. The emperor walked in alone and had a short conversation with the blind young man. When the emperor got up and walked back to the courtyard door, he was not as serious as before. His face was more relaxed and relaxed. Qin Wang smiled and said, Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have one more schemer. The emperor laughed heartily and said, Qin Shaobao is not any worse than him. They're just 2 different people. Sun Yin is not a worldly person, but he practices the wild fox Zen. The scholar surnamed Liu in the courtyard is a true worldly person, a wild fox spirit. But to truly rule the country and pacify the world, it still depends on you, Qin Wang. In the courtyard, the blind Lu Su was lying on a rattan chair. The female warrior of Jing'an Palace, whose real name was Lu Lingbao, knelt in front of the emperor for not long. When she got up, her face was full of confusion. Lu Su asked softly, "Are you wondering why I want to kill Bailiang?" The woman who had followed Mr. Lu all the way smiled and said, "You must have your reasons." Lu Su opened his eyes, as if he wanted to see with his own eyes this world where no one was free. Chapter 1455. Su Fengnian knew that there would be a battle between him and Tuoba Bodhisattva, but he did not expect it to be so soon. Su Fengnian helped the old monk who gave him the Buddha bowl to bury him. He piled up the grave, erected a monument, and used his finger as a knife to carve the words, "Grave of the Monk in Chicken Soup." He wanted to add an epitaph, but he did not know the content of the song called Falling Lotus, so he could only give up. After doing all this, Su Fengnian had no choice but to look for 2 suitable weapons. However, after hesitating for a long time, he realized that this trivial matter was unusually difficult. Su Fengnian even had the leisure to squat in front of the grave and sigh. In the past, only by risking one's life could one be qualified to gamble with one's life. For example, when he faced the devil Xie Ling from the Duckhead Green Inn, Tuoba Chunsun, who had 2 powerful retainers, Diwu Raccoon Yang Taisui and the others, as well as when he faced Huang Qing with Sword Aura and a Beimang True Dragon, Su Fengnian did not think much about it. In fact, he did not have time to think deeply about it. It was like a battle between a cavalry and a scout, where life and death were decided. As for the human cat Han Xingxian and Wang Xianji, Su Fengnian had enough time to plan. However, those calculations seemed to be on the edge and he did not dare to be distracted. The only exception was the fight with Tuoba Bodhisattva. Once the fight was unavoidable and there was a few hours to half a day of leisurely travel, Su Fengnian did not have any complicated feelings. Instead, he felt somewhat relaxed, as if he was waiting for a friend he had never met before. Presumably, after seeing Tuoba Bodhisattva for the first time, Su Fengnian guessed that he might not be able to hold back his laughter and say, "You're here." Then Su Fengnian thought that this question did not display the demeanor of a master. As one of the 4 grandmasters of the world, since the 2 of them were going to fight to the death, there was an 80 to 90% chance that one of them would die. Since they were going to fight to the death upon meeting, shouldn't there be a more heroic greeting? For example, Tuoba Bodhisattva, you've been the second in the world for decades, so you're going to die with this laughable title? Or perhaps they could bring 2 jars of wine over and drink before the fight. However, the spy report did not mention whether Tuoba Bodhisattva drank or not. What if this guy did not drink at all? Could he tell him not to fight first and wait for him to drink before fighting? However, Su Fengnian did not have the capacity to finish 2 jars of wine in 2 breaths. Wandering alone in front of the thatched cottage tomb, Su Fengnian suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He felt that he could really fight with wine. Even if Tuoba Bodhisattva did not drink, he could just say that whoever died, the living would offer a jar of wine to the deceased as a farewell. This kind of speech not only had the air of an expert, but also the spirit of an expert who lived and died like a guest traveling far away. The 6-jewel Bodhisattva on Mount Lontuo, who had heard the news, saw the young lord squatting there and laughing secretly. She was dumbfounded. What was going on? Don't you know that the entire Lontuo mountain is about to explode? She calmed herself down and said with a cold face, "The first group of 20,000 monk soldiers near Lontuo mountain can be gathered in 2 days and rushed to Liuzhou." Su Fengnian walked into the thatched cottage and brought 2 small wooden stools under the eaves. He threw one to her and the 2 of them sat together in the afterglow of the setting sun. He smiled and said, "You guys are really insincere. The prayer wheel has already been pushed, but you still want to wait for me to defeat Tuoba Bodhisattva before sending the troops?" The 6-jewel Bodhisattva did not hide anything. 1 generation after another, at most 300 to 400 years of life. But do you know how long Lontuo Mountain has existed in the world? Su Fengnian stared at her face that seemed to be unmarked by time. Back then, the top 10 aristocratic families of the spring and autumn period also thought the same. They always felt that the throne of the country could be broken, but the family's incense could not be extinguished. "I originally thought that the monks of Lontuo Mountain would be more worldly." She sneered and said, "If they were worldly, why would our Lontuo Mountain care about you, King of Bailiang? Why would we get involved in this mess? Don't push your luck." Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "Who said that worldly affairs means closing the door and hiding in the outer mountains of sky beyond mountain and not caring about the secular world? Your Lantua Mountain's worldly affairs are very impressive and I am convinced. But the Wudong Daoist monks left the mountain to cultivate, and the two Zen temples cultivate Buddhism for a day, which I admire even more. Whether it was Wudong's Immortal or Liangchan Temple's Buddha, it was just the scenery on the other side of the river. They had also found ferries. They would cross the river as many feet as they could, and they would carry as many people as they could. Moreover, they never accepted money from others, nor did they mind drowning. They only wanted to carry one more person. No wonder the useless monk wanted to leave Lantua Mountain. If he stayed on the mountain, he would only be Lu Songtao for the rest of his life. The six-jewel bodhisattva said expressionlessly, "How can the 1,000-year Lantua Mountain's dharma be destroyed by a few words from Su Fengnian? At the end of the day, you are still thinking about the tens of thousands of monk soldiers. Stop pretending." Su Fengnian sighed and said, "Our paths are different and we speak the same language." The six-jewel bodhisattva frowned and said, "Tuoba Bodhisattva is on his way here. Aren't you going to run? You have only absorbed the remaining spring and autumn fate. Do you really think you have recovered to your peak state?" Su Fengnian rolled his eyes and said, "I am the only one holding a lantern in this pitch-black night. Do you think Tuoba Bodhisattva is blind? The east is Baoyang's territory and I can't run there. Go north to Gusai Prefecture? I think the Beimang Empress and the Taiping Commandant will treat me with good wine and meat. Or is the west further west? What's the point? As for the south? Qin Jibao and Xia Guaning should have smelled the fishy smell." Su Fengnian's expression was calm. "Why run? Let's fight first. It's not like I will definitely lose or die. Besides, I have always wanted to be in Jianghu. The first time I was in Jianghu, it felt like real Jianghu. It was just that I was not happy at all. I was like a dog paddling in Jianghu and I often choked on water. Unfortunately, after a few times I became more and more capable, but I did not see myself as a Jianghu person. This time I plan to walk Jianghu for myself. I will not paddle across the river nor cross the lake by boat. I want to float across freely." The six-pearl bodhisattva glanced at the inconspicuous grave where the chicken soup monk was buried and said indifferently, "If you die in the west at the hands of Tuoba Bodhisattva, it might be difficult for others to collect your corpse." Su Fengnian said seriously, "A child's words carry no harm." The six-pearl bodhisattva looked at the imposing manor in the east that ordinary people could not see. "Tuoba Bodhisattva is in a hurry to kill you." Su Fengnian did not look at the magnificent scene. There would be plenty of opportunities to admire it later. Perhaps Su Fengnian could not bear not to look at it. He would vomit if he looked. Su Fengnian said to himself, "After Li Chungang returned to Jianghu, the old man went with me back to Baoyang for a while before we left. Before we left, he used two words to describe Jianghu people. He said that Wang Mingyin, who was ranked 11th in the world, was calm and steady, like a mighty river in front of him. Xianyuan Jingqing in the great snow plains was reserved. He did not use a single word, but he was romantic. Qi Xuanzhen on the devil-slaying platform was ancient. The moon rose from the east and the cool breeze followed. Zhao Xituan of the Dragon Tiger Mountain was broad-minded. He lived for 100 years. Dong Tai was strong and vigorous. His spirit was like a rainbow and he walked through clouds and wind. Chao Chongqing was sad and indignant. He lived for 100 years and his thoughts were cold and disheartened. Wang Xinji was old but strong. He was in the best state. He could be said to be the first grade of vigorous. The sky was full of wind and waves and the sea and mountains were vast. His spirit was full and all things were by his side. The six-pearl bodhisattva patiently listened to him ramble on about the stories of his old friends. In fact, she was listening with great interest. After all, if she had not appeared here today, these stories would probably rot in someone's stomach for the rest of their lives. Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "Are there any good weapons on Mount Lantuo? It would be best if they were swords. If there are any divine weapons, you can lend them to me." The bodhisattva of six pearls looked at the scene in the east and shook her head. "There are an ancient sword called Fong Sheng, and a blade called Qi Yun. They were both forged in the Dafeng dynasty. However, Tuoba had already found you by the time I came and went." Su Fengnian smiled. "At most, I'll let Tuoba wait for you to arrive before starting the fight. If he doesn't agree, I'll run toward Mount Lantuo. I'll be able to wait for you to get the sword. All right, while I'm fighting with Tuoba, help me keep an eye on Wang Weishua, who is currently in the Dong family in the inner city. As long as he doesn't leave the western region, you don't have to interfere." The Bodhisattva of 6 pearls stood up slowly. Her gaze was complicated. Why don't you disperse your fate energy? Toba will lose his target. You don't have to fight this battle. Su Fengnian said helplessly, how long has it been since the old monk was buried? Aren't you afraid that he'll jump out and smash your face with a bowl? You're not afraid, but I am. Moreover, my intuition tells me that if we fight here today, it might be more advantageous and have a higher chance of winning than if we fight in the future. If we avoid him now, even if we recover our cultivation in the future, our state of mind will be weaker. She sneered. In the end, you, Su Fengnian, still want to take advantage of the vast battlefield in the western region to fight to your heart's content. What intuition are you talking about? Su Fengnian smiled awkwardly. Then he looked angry and embarrassed. He glared at her and said, don't hit my face when you're fighting and don't expose my shortcomings when you're scolding. The Bodhisattva of 6 pearls disappeared in a flash. Su Fengnian sat alone on the stool. Chapter 1456. Little Lanta Mountain was the backyard of one of the 3 families in the inner city, King of Hell Sima family. However, the Dong family had launched a bloody massacre that had been planned for a long time. Almost half of them survived overnight. However, a centipede dies but never falls down. After the Dong family hit a wall with the young drunkard on the roof, especially when the young master of the Aquarius state heard that Chicken Soup Monk had given an alms bowl to Tai Mu Daya, the young swordsman who had once assassinated Yen Wenluan with his sect, the Great Yu House, came to the thatched cottage at the foot of the mountain. The cautious Wang Weishua mistook him for a protective amulet that the old monk had pasted on the Sima family's door. Therefore, he ordered the Dong family's assassins to stop pursuing the Sima family. Su Fengnian, who was sitting leisurely on the bench, also felt the strength and resilience of the city. The Sima family was already in a miserable state. If it were a family in the Central Plains, the monkeys would have fled when the tree fell. However, the Sima family still sent more than 30 men of sacrifice, whose clothes were still wet from blood to swords, to protect a similar number of women, children, and the elderly. It seemed that this was the last bit of the Sima family's spirit left. Obviously, they really regarded Su Fengnian, who was sitting on the bench under the thatched cottage, as a life-saving amulet. After the 6-jewel bodhisattva came and went like a ghost, the Sima family's spirit rose a little. After all, in the western region it was not a bad thing to have a connection with Lantuo Mountain. Su Fengnian, who had nothing to do, looked at the people 200 steps away. They were also looking at him, a strange guest of unknown origin. Among them, the eyes of the children were wide open. They were all holding weapons. Whether it was the weapons or the tragic situation tonight, it was too heavy for them. Many children still had tears on their faces. There were slightly tall boys comforting the little girls beside them. There were also adult men with crossbows who were bandaging their wounds with the help of the women. There were also nimble children who picked up arrows from somewhere and tiptoed carefully to put them into their elders' quiver. In order to prevent the Dong family's assassins from assassinating under the cover of the night, lanterns were hung on the branches of the trees. The lights were unusually bright. In the night breeze, Su Fengnian looked at them. The children were also staring blankly at this powerful figure who could make friends with the Bodhisattva of Lantuo Mountain. Then, under the escort of several experts from the inner city who were more skilled than the retainers of ordinary families, a woman with a huge ox-horned bow on her back walked towards Su Fengnian. Her graceful figure, slender waist, long legs, and the huge killing weapon were particularly eye-catching in the light. Su Fengnian slowly got up, thinking that he was helping the monk who called himself the senior brother of the monk of the dragon tree to entertain the guests. However, he obviously underestimated his momentum. When he bent down and got up, except for the woman, the other 3 experts suddenly froze. Then, when they found that the mistress was still moving forward, they gripped their weapons tightly and followed her. Before Su Fengnian stood up, he found that the group of people were so nervous, so he sat back down, thinking that this would probably make them feel more at ease. However, he did not expect that his rise and fall would completely irritate the group of frightened birds. They whistled and shouted. Without saying anything, a relatively young man stood in front of the mistress and pointed his saber at her. He stared at Su Fengnian as if he was going to fight to the death. Su Fengnian felt a little helpless. "Do you want me to stand or sit?" The woman whispered to the experts beside her, who were trained by her family for thousands of days, and then asked them to stay 50 steps away. She walked in front of Su Fengyan alone and smiled as she pointed at the bench where the six-jewel bodhisattva sat. Su Fengyan nodded. She took off the ox-horned bow and sat down. She smiled and said, "Young master, please don't mind. Our Sima family is really jittery tonight. Oh, I forgot to ask you, can you understand me?" Su Fengyan smiled and said, "I'm not from Beimang. Of course I can understand Madame Chai's Central Plains official language." Not only this city but the entire western region knew that the head of the Sima family was Madame Chai. After marrying into the Sima family, no woman took her husband's surname. She had been in charge of the family for 20 years, so some of the three families in the inner city called the Sima family the Chai family. Su Fengyan had gathered intelligence in the Whispering Room and learned that Madame Chai was a refugee from Dongyue. She was forced to migrate to this place, and the elders in her family quickly withered away. She was alone and pitifully married into the Sima family, which was still struggling in the outer city. It could be said that she had personally managed the Sima family to its current status. As for the hardships she had gone through, Su Fengyan did not know about them, nor did he have any interest in them. She said bluntly, "Since young master is not a Beimang barbarian, then I'll be frank with you. If I offend you in any way, please don't be angry. As long as young master can protect the 124 members of the Sima family, no matter what young master wants, as long as I can afford it, I'll give it to you." Su Fengyan did not say anything. This madam, who was almost 40 years old but was still more charming than a young woman, had a determined look in her eyes. "Perhaps young master feels that the Sima family is not worth mentioning, but I can guarantee that as long as we survive this crisis, as long as the Sima family's golden name is not completely destroyed tonight, then I'll be able to gather 2,000 people again in less than half a year." Then she suddenly felt a little miserable. That young man was actually looking into the distance in a daze at this critical moment that concerned the survival of her family. For her to be able to lead her family to this day, she naturally had her own perseverance. She said in a more serious tone, "Maybe young master is a man from the Central Plains who happened to pass by the western regions, or maybe you are a first-rate talent from the most prominent sect in the Liang River Lake. You have the ambition to reach the peak of martial arts, and you don't care about the glory and disgrace of one or two families in the western regions. However, I sincerely ask young master to help us this time. The Sima family will definitely be grateful to young master. In the future, as long as young master sends a message back to the western regions, even if it is the southern Jiang, the Liao Kingdom or the Liang capital, if I am still alive, I will personally lead my family's elite forces to young master. Even if I am already dead, the next head of the Sima family will definitely not refuse to help young master. If I, Chai Dongdi, violate my oath, then I'll never be able to be a human again." Su Fengyan turned to look at this woman, his eyes in a trance. Her eyes instantly became cold and her tone also became colder. "I've said it before. As long as I can afford it, young master can take it away." In her life, she had seen too many men show this kind of expression in front of her. In the early years, it was the influential people in the outer city, and later, it was the ambitious people in the inner city, such as Dong Tiling of the Dong family, the father and sons of the Li family, and those men who were arrogant because they were masters on the ranking list. She said expressionlessly, "But I'll only give young master what he wants once." She was no longer the ignorant girl who thought that there were chivalrous people everywhere in Jianghu. For so many years, for the sake of this family, she followed the rules of the western region and did many things that went beyond the bottom line of morality. She was cruel, bloody, dirty, scheming and trapping. But for herself, there was one thing that she had always kept to her bottom line. She originally thought that in a few years, or at most 10 years, the western region would no longer talk about her appearance as Madame Chai, and there would no longer be any young people who would drool over her figure. Then she would be able to live up to the memory of her husband, who only had a surname left. Su Fengyan did not become angry because of the misunderstanding. He only smiled. "Madame Chai is thinking too much. It's just that you reminded me of a very important person." He turned to look in the northeast direction and said softly, "I miss her very much. In fact, I've always missed her." She was stunned on the spot as she looked at the side of his face that was filled with warmth. She could see that this man's longing at this moment could not be faked. She suddenly felt sad and self-deprecating for no reason. The things that appeared on his face were the most extravagant things in the western region. She, a woman who had rebuked the winds and clouds of the western region for 20 years, had never felt this way before. Su Fengyan retracted his gaze and smiled. The person I'm waiting for hasn't arrived yet, so I do have some time left. Instead of sitting here in a daze, I might as well make a deal with you. Even someone as calm as her could not help but reveal a pleasantly surprised expression. However, the young man's next words made her feel as if she had been struck by lightning. Madam Chai, is there really only one time? Can we talk about it again? Whether it was her imposing manner, her arrogance, or her temperament, they were all exhausted at the first spurt of energy. Although Madam Chai was still angry this time, she was no longer as solemn and stirring as before. On the contrary, it was probably because she was too old, so even if she was angry, she still had a different kind of charm. At this moment she seemed a little shy. Su Fengyan laughed heartily and waved his hand. Alright, let's stop joking. It's just that I felt that your heartstrings were too tense earlier and that this kind of injury was actually endless. Madam, you're an expert in using the bow, so you should know the principle of relaxation. Let's talk about business. To tell you the truth, I have some secret operations in the inner city. In the last half a year, I've established a power in the inner city. Madam, you might have already met that sour old scholar. He's one of my men in the western region. Madam Chai's expression became serious. Most women in the world were like this. After the pleasant surprise, she could not help but fuss over every little thing. She softly asked, I heard that the old man surnamed Lu either has a background in Baoyang, or he's an expert from the God of Fortune's Li family, one in the open and one in the dark. In fact, they're both from Liang and Zhaogo. Chapter 1457. Su Fengyan shook his head. That's not important. I can guarantee that the Sima family will continue to be one of the great families in the inner city. As long as you work with that old scholar, not only will you be able to struggle at death's door under the Dong family's nose, but you will also be able to squeeze out the Dong family. If you want people, I can give you people that are not inferior to those on the inner city's expert list. As long as you dare to ask, I can give you a lot. If you want armor, crossbows, spears, I can give them all to you. As for my request, it's very simple. The Sima family must have a cavalry of no less than 5,000 people in this city. When they are willing to put their heads on their belts to fight for riches and honor, when there is hope for riches and honor, you must make them believe that your words are not empty words. Su Fengyan paused for a long time. Whether or not I will be able to see these things in the future, Madam Chai, you can rest assured. When you find that old scholar surnamed Lu, you can tell him that I told you that his name is Lu Wenbao, Shamawei Post House, Old Locust Tree. He will naturally believe you and will do his best to cooperate with you in the future. However, I will also say the ugly words first. If you and the Sima family don't keep your promise and become cowards when it's time for you to fight for your lives, or if someone comes to you in the future to give you more benefits, then please remember that whatever I can give to the Sima family tonight, I will take it back in double whether or not I appear in the future. Your western regions are messing around in this small piece of land. What inner city, what outer city, what experts, what three great families, there will be a day when you will understand that they are really nothing. Madam Chai smiled sweetly and nodded. That's right. In the eyes of the great king of Baoyang, other than Baimang's million-strong army, there is nothing else important. Other than the emperor of Liyang and the empress of Baimang, there is no one else important, right? Su Fengyan was surprised. You guessed it. She was silent for a moment, then smiled. I was just making things up. Your Highness must only be so easily tricked in front of insignificant women, right? Su Fengyan didn't deny anything. He couldn't help but laugh. It's not good to hold grudges. It was Madam Chai's turn to be stunned. Are you really the king of Baoyang? Su Fengyan joked back. What? You're too easy to talk to. You don't look like a border king with authority? Or is it that he can sit on a small stool and chat with Madam for half a day? No matter how I look at him, he doesn't look like an expert. Madam Chai blinked her eyes. Didn't they say that His Highness is extremely handsome? There are quite a few well-informed young girls in the inner city who are extremely curious about the prince. There are also a few in our Sima family who used to practice the sword, but when they heard that the prince started out by practicing the saber, they foolishly went to practice the saber. I've been nagging about His Highness's name all day. Even my ears are about to grow calluses. Su Fengyan was speechless. He stretched out a finger and tapped the space between his eyebrows. He smiled bitterly. Women. Madam Chai looked at the distant family members who had survived the turmoil and calmly said, There's a girl called Sima Bishui. She vowed that she would go to Bailiang to find that guy called Su Fengyan if she could one day master a peerless saber technique. Even if she couldn't become his wife, she could become his confidant. Many people made fun of her, but she didn't have any talent. She just buried herself in practicing the saber. Su Fengyan softly said, "And then she died." She nodded and said in a calm voice, "That's right. She couldn't kill anyone and didn't want to be humiliated, so she killed herself with a saber. She stabbed her abdomen and didn't lightly slit her neck. If she had died in the latter way, those men wouldn't have let her off. In our Western regions, such simple fools, especially women, don't live long. Even if they're lucky enough to survive, they won't live happily." Su Fengyan followed her line of sight and looked at the group of people who were laughing and talking without worry. He sighed with emotion. "There'll be a day when the world will be peaceful. When that time comes, your Western regions will also be filled with the sound of books. Children won't be thinking about how to survive every day. Instead, they'll be thinking about how to study hard and obtain scholarly honors. In the future, there'll also be willow trees and men and women who will meet at dusk. Young people will do what they should have done when they were young. In the future, there'll be rattan chairs for old people to lie on and bask in the sun. They'll slowly recall the heroic deeds they were proud of and the things they regretted. When their lives come to an end, they'll be able to peacefully pass on their unfulfilled wishes to their children and grandchildren." Madame Chai gently shook her head with a smile. It was as if she couldn't believe that the soil under her feet was soaked with blood and that such a beautiful scene of paradise would one day appear. However, she subconsciously reached out to stroke a strand of messy black hair and gently tucked it behind her ear. However, she suddenly straightened her body and tightly gripped the horn bough by her feet. In front of her sharp eyes, there seemed to be traces of ripples as thin as strands of hair. In the distance there was a muffled and oppressive sound. The three experts in the inner city looked around in panic. In the end they could only see the scene closest to them. It was a large tree with dense branches and leaves. A corpse wearing tight black clothes fell from the tree. It must be known that there were 3 large lanterns hanging on the tree. It was obvious that the people in the Sima family didn't find any trace of this person from beginning to end. However, what really made the 3 experts in the inner city feel their hands and feet go cold was that they simply couldn't see the young man sitting on the small bench. He looked harmless and gentle, but when he killed people he didn't leave a trace. A great master. He was definitely a great master that even the top 3 experts in the inner city, Dong Tiling, paled in comparison. Because Madame Chai was close to the water, and because she was an expert in the inner city who was ranked just below Dong Tiling, she could barely see the mysterious ripples. She roughly knew that in the Liyang River Lake the martial man realm was divided into 9 levels. The second level was considered to be a great master in the Central Plains. She barely stood on the threshold of the second level and saw a bit of the spectacular scene in the inner city. She used to think that if she could put down her family's affairs and focus on martial arts, then it would be easy for her to become one of the top 3 experts in the inner city. She might even be able to compete with the legendary first-level experts in the Liyang River Lake. As for the previous 10 people in the martial arts evaluation and the recent 14 people in the martial arts evaluation and the 4 great masters, she didn't have any idea what they were. She only knew that they were very strong. It was like looking at a mountain from afar. You know that the mountain peak was very high, but you can't imagine how high it was until you get close. Then the young man beside her, whose identity she was still doubtful about, opened the door to the first level for her in a slightly stingy and obscure way. Then she suddenly realized that in the eyes of the small group of true martial arts masters, the first-level experts who considered themselves to be extraordinary were no different from ants. Then even the children of the Sima family could see a strange scene. From the shadows in the distance, a ghostly figure suddenly appeared, running as fast as thunder with an aggressive aura. They thought that it was an expert from the Dong family who came to kill people in broad daylight, and that it might even be the infamous Dong Tiling himself. But soon everyone was confused. The expert with a very strong figure did not seem to be here to cause trouble, but was pushed here by someone. He seemed to be avoiding something invisible, except for the period when he was constantly approaching the thatched cottage. At the same time his footsteps were disorderly and he flapped around in all directions. He was in a very sorry state. Obviously no one was fighting with him, but he made a few dazzling front, back and side somersaults. In short, there were all kinds of somersaults. He was originally a very strong expert, but in the end he was reduced to a sideshow in the eyes of the children of the Sima family. When he was about 30 steps away from the thatched cottage, he finally stopped to catch his breath. At this time, Madame Chai finally saw the old man. He was actually the god of wealthy family's most honorable consecrator. At this time, his clothes were ragged, as if they had been cut into pieces bit by a sharp weapon, dripping with blood. He glared at the young man sitting on the stool and said in a hoarse voice, "Dong Tai's nurturing sword and controlling sword, I finally know who you are." Su Fengyan looked at Zhao Go, one of the founding members of Li Yong. "The only reason you're still alive is because you had a colleague in Azure City." Before he died, he said a few words which was equivalent to him dying in your place. "You can go now, but remember to tell Li Feng Mao not to compete with the Sima family in the future. As for your plans in the western regions, they have been following the rules these past few years, so I can pretend that I didn't see them." The thin elder roared and rushed forward, causing the dust under his feet to fly up. The tip of his foot created a hole in the ground, but the elder quickly stopped. Madame Chai squinted her eyes and saw a flying sword that was less than an inch long, hovering in front of the elder's forehead. The sword's body was dark green, sparkling and translucent. It was a beautiful little sword that could make people feel happy. Madame Chai's lips curled up slightly as she thought of a certain person's sigh. Women. The old man, who could cover the sky with one hand in this city, glanced at the young man who was mostly covered in skin. He snorted coldly and retreated. He leaped onto a branch and quickly disappeared into the ink-black night. Su Fengyan's mind moved and he put away the flying swords into his sleeve. He then pointed at the 30-years-old man who had pulled out his sword and asked with a smile, "What's his name? How long has it been since he joined the Sima family?" Madame Chai's mind was very sharp, and immediately a haze appeared in her heart. She looked sadly at the man who she had high hopes for. "He's the youngest person on the inner city's expert list. He's known as an assassin who's better than the Dong family's assassins. He's been working for the Sima family since his father's generation. It's probably because a man's heart is not content, or because he doesn't want his descendants to be someone else's servant." Madame Chai, who was sitting on the stool with Su Fengyan, said coldly, "Isn't that right, Tao Disong?" Chapter 1458. The dignified man pursed his lips. He didn't refute or admit anything. He just stared at Madame Chai. Of course, Su Fengyan just watched from the side. Previously, when Tao Disong saw him stand up, his killing intent was still within reason, and could be understood as him wanting to protect his master. But after seeing the Dong family assassin fall from the tree, the killing intent of a martial artist in a dangerous situation was not something that could be explained by a loyal servant of the Sima family. Su Fengyan sighed. He lowered his head and rubbed his cheeks. He felt a little bitter. The Wutongan county had been living in harmony for so many years. How could the Sima family in the western regions be so unpredictable? Tao Disong didn't reveal his true intentions. He just looked at Madame Chai, who was 8 years older than him. Madame Chai seemed to realize the truth. She was furious. She scolded, "When did the Sima family ever stop you from being a superior person? They have spent so much effort to cultivate you. Are you heartless and unscrupulous? In the western regions there is no benevolence, no righteousness and no loyalty. But don't forget that everyone in the western regions believes in the word, trust. No matter how evil you are, as long as you promise something, you will keep your promise. Even the children in the city know this." Tao Disong's face was wooden. "Madam, I have respected you since I was young. I have treated you like a female bodhisattva." Madame Chai said angrily, "Shut up." She suddenly stood up and grabbed the ox-horn bow. In an instant, the bow was drawn to the shape of a full moon. It was clear that her martial arts cultivation was indeed one of the best in the city. Tao Disong didn't care about that huge bow at all. He didn't care about that sharp iron arrow that was ready to be shot out. He only looked at Madame Chai and murmured, "When I became sensible, especially when I found out that I was more talented in martial arts than all the men in the family, I told myself that one day, I would make Madame Chai's life less tiring." Su Fengyan muttered under his breath, "You're trying to say that you won't be so lonely, right?" He emphasized the word, lonely. When Madame Chai heard this, she was so angry that she almost turned around and shot this guy to death. Tao Disong looked up to the sky and laughed. He laughed until tears came out of his eyes. He raised his arm and wiped his eyes. He looked at Madame Chai's face and his eyes began to emit a man's unique passion. "Madam, why do you have to live such a tiring life? In 5 years I will be in the top 3 of the inner city's top 3. In 10 years I, Tao Desong, will be the #1 expert in the inner city. 5 years later I will be 35 years and you will be 43. You won't be old. And you will look like a woman in her youth. You are the most beautiful woman in the world. Even if you 10 years later you will be old, madam, you, the most beautiful woman. Even if you in 10 years you. Madame Chai was going to shoot an arrow at Tao Desong's face when he moved. Although she wasn't sure if she would succeed, she definitely wouldn't let this ingrate continue talking. However, there was a guy beside her who interrupted her. He said that if Tao Desong told her what was on his mind, he would completely give up. Madame Chai would have a clear conscience after killing her own family. However, she soon regretted it. This Tao Desong, who had been respectful to her like a junior for many years, was actually dead. In her memory he was still living a bright life in the western region. Therefore she didn't hesitate to shoot that arrow. Tao Desong finally revealed the true face he had hidden for many years. He rushed forward and tilted his body to the right. After dodging the arrow, he continued to rush toward the thatched cottage. He laughed sinisterly and said, "Madam, since I can't have you while I'm alive, let's go to the Yellow Springs together. Before we reach the gates of hell, I, Tao Desong, will..." Without giving Tao Desong a chance to say another word, his neck was pierced through by a powerful eagle feather arrow. His entire body was sent flying backwards by the great force of the arrow, smashing heavily on the ground with his back. Perhaps this was the western region. The winner takes all and the loser takes all. It was always so fast. It wasn't at all like the Jianghu feuds in the Central Plains. They had to use all kinds of schemes to get to the bottom of the matter. Su Fengnian's eyes were calm. He said in a low voice, "I remember there was a man called Lu Qiantang. When he was about to die he was much more manly than you. He was the real Jianghu man." Tao Desong died with his eyes wide open because he knew that his wife, who had fought side by side with him not long ago, had not been seriously injured in the fight with the top assassins of the Dong family, but her chi was in a mess, and it was impossible for her to kill him within 10 arrows. Of course he knew that with the help of that strange man he could not kill his wife, but in the end he could not even die a slower death in his wife's hands, because his throat was pierced by that man's flying sword before the eagle feather arrow. This ambitious man only had one thought in his mind before he died. "Madam Chai, I really like you." But the other expert of the Sima family, who was more loyal and devoted than him, strode towards Tao Desong's body. With one kick he was sent flying more than 10 feet away. His body rolled on the ground. Thus no one knew about the 2 lines of tears on his face before he died. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Madam, you can go about your business. Anyway, we have already finalized the deal. You still have a mess to clean up. You don't have to pay attention to me." However, Madame Chai unexpectedly sat back down on the stool. The stool was small, and in order to deal with tonight's assassination, she had quickly changed into a set of night clothes, which made her but look like a full moon. Su Fengnian didn't remind her. Maybe she didn't realize it, or maybe she didn't care. Or maybe she just didn't want to squint at him. She had some unspeakable, boring, competitive spirit. A woman's heart was like a needle at the bottom of the sea. She looked at the family that was still orderly despite the chaos. She said softly, "If you want to be busy, it's easy. There will always be things that you can't finish. I have been busy for over 20 years. At first I was nervous and flustered. Later on I became confident and familiar with the way things were. But after all, I have always been busy. Even in my dreams I was thinking about how to expand the family business. Today I finally have the chance to take a break." Su Fengnian smiled indifferently. "My luck is better than yours. I have only started to be busy these few years. Even if I don't make the decision for my family, no matter how difficult the situation is, we will not panic." Su Fengnian suddenly turned his head and said helplessly, "Madame Chai, do you really not understand that I am asking you to leave, or are you pretending not to understand? You are taking a break from your busy schedule, but I also want to sit here alone and quietly stare blankly." She made an "oh" sound and didn't say anything else. She also didn't have any intention of getting up. Su Fengnian dismissed it with a smile. She suddenly shouted out a name and waved her hand in the distance. Soon a 13 or 14-year-old girl ran over timidly. She was a complete beauty and bore a 70 to 80% resemblance to Madame Chai. However, the resemblance was only 40 to 50%. After all, Madame Chai's current temperament had been honed through countless hardships. The girl had grown up under the protection of her warm wings, so the only thing that resembled her was her natural appearance. The girl who had two splendid sabers hanging from her waist, squatted beside Madame Chai. She didn't dare to look at Su Fengnian. Madame Chai stroked the girl's head. "Taihe is my daughter. I heard people say that the most powerful experts in the Central Plains either don't use weapons or use swords. She only started practicing sabers at the end of last year and only found this pair of sabers after rummaging through the weapons storage at home. Taihe, look, this young master is the one you're looking for. Didn't you quarrel with your best friend over who should be the wife of that person before the new year? Now you've taken the initiative earlier than that stupid girl from the Li family. Let me tell you, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If you miss this village, there won't be this shop again." The young girl suddenly raised her head and widened her eyes. "Him?" Madame Chai nodded with a smile. She glanced at the young man who was laughing involuntarily from the corner of her eyes. There was a hint of schadenfreude hidden in her eyes. The girl suddenly turned her head and instantly turned back. Her face was full of resentment and suspicion. "You don't look like him at all." Su Fengnian smiled bitterly. He thought to himself, could this Tai Madare's face be similar to mine? However, it's best if they don't look like each other. Do I really have to deal with this stupid girl from the western region and have a conversation with her that says, "You are Su Fengnian, yes, really? And of course it's real." Su Fengnian felt his scalp go numb when he thought of this. At the same time, he couldn't help but laugh. "Old man Li, with your arrogant personality when you were young, you must have been even more annoyed than me back then, right?" Madame Chai added fuel to the fire and whispered, "Silly girl, it's really him. He's wearing a fake face. Otherwise, do you think that person would swagger into the western region? Do you think I'm lying to you?" Su Fengnian covered his forehead with his hand. No one would have thought that this girl would cry out without any warning. If it weren't for Madame Chai gently covering the girl's mouth, she would have wailed without restraint. She stopped crying with great difficulty and turned her head again. She looked at Su Fengnian seriously and sobbed, "Big Sister Bis, we really liked you," the naive girl quickly added in a sobbing tone. "Big Sister Bis, we also liked you a lot, but she died today. Can you help me write a few words? When I visit her grave in the future, I'll burn it for her, okay?" Madame Chai sighed softly. There was a pleading look in her eyes. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "But we don't have a pen and ink right now." Then the seemingly weak girl cut off a piece of her sleeve and handed it to Su Fengnian. She then asked him to extend his hand. Finally, she used her right hand to cut open a large wound on her left palm. Blood flowed onto Su Fengnian's palm. Chapter 1459. Madame Chai didn't hide the pride on her face. "My daughter's temperament is naturally like mine. She won't lose to the fiercest man in the western regions." Su Fengnian raised his arm and blood flowed down his fingertips. He wrote the name, Sima Bisui, on the sleeve. The young girl hurriedly said, "Add your name too." He had no choice but to add the 3 words Su Fengnian. The young girl treasured the sleeve that only had 2 names written on it. Looking at the bloody words, she couldn't help but sob. However, she quickly wiped her tears with her arm and pitifully looked at Su Fengnian. "Why don't you write one for me too?" Without waiting for Su Fengnian to speak, she began to cut her clothes in one breath. Then she made a cut on her other hand. Su Fengnian hurriedly stopped her. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All right, I'm afraid of you. Just give me the sleeve." Su Fengnian took the sleeve. His right index finger gently poked the pad of his left middle finger. He wrote, "Su Fengnian Sima Tiaha," on the sleeve. The young girl stretched her neck and stared at the sleeve. She softly said, "In between the 2 names, add the word, gift." Su Fengnian added another word. With the 2 sleeves in her hands, the young girl was satisfied. She carefully put away the sleeve book, and solemnly thanked Su Fengnian. Only then did she stand up and leave. With her back to him and her mother, she secretly sobbed as she walked far away. Su Fengnian smiled. "Madame Chai, you have a good daughter." Madame Chai nodded. "Who said otherwise? My only wish in this life is to not let her live like me." Originally, this wish was almost shattered. Fortunately, Prince appeared here today. She finally stood up. The corners of her mouth held a happy smile. "I won't disturb Prince's peaceful cultivation." Su Fengnian raised his head and said, "Live well." In her entire life, Madame Chai had never treated a man with such sincerity. Su Fingyan closed his eyes. You must live well in Dunhuang, you must wait for me. In the next 6 hours, the Sima clan had already begun to disperse under Madame Chai's orders. In the meantime, she and her daughter had stood side by side and looked at Su Fingyan, who was sitting under the eaves with his eyes closed, from afar. When the cottage returned to silence, Su Fingyan opened his eyes. As expected, the six-jewel bodhisattva did not return with the sword and saber from Mount Lontua. In that case, they could only make do with it for now. In the upcoming battle, it wasn't up to anyone to decide who was magnanimous or extravagant. They had to haggle over every detail. The key was to see who could last until the end. Su Fingyan tore off his face and slowly stood up. His 2 big sleeves fluttered in the wind. In the light, he looked like an immortal who was free and unfettered in the mortal world. Su Fingyan raised an arm. The whole city was filled with swords. Long swords, short swords, ancient swords, new swords, all of them flew over and chirped cheerfully. In the straight line in front of him, the swords were connected head to tail. They were arranged in a row and hovered in the air. There was once an old man who dripped water on a path in the rain to form a sword. Su Fingyan smiled. The wind was strong. This time there was no need to talk. Su Fingyan's arm gently pushed forward and then began to move forward. The swords connected and finally converged into a long sword that was hundreds of feet long. Su Fingyan said in a low voice, "Let's go." This sword in an instant broke out of the city. It crashed into the Baimang military god, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was rushing toward the city. Dunhuang City. In the middle of the night, there was a woman who was a light sleeper. When her child cried, she quickly put on her clothes and gently picked up the child from the cradle. The child's tears quickly turned into laughter. She lowered her head and looked at the childish smiling face. She also smiled. She gently swayed her arm and slowly hummed, little sweet potato, grow up quickly." Zhao Bing, the king of Yanqi, had an army of no more than 100,000 soldiers under his command, but he actually had more than 200,000 soldiers and horses under his command. Among them, the infantry generals Zhang Dingyuan and Gu Ying. One was adept at playing to his strengths and avoiding his weaknesses, and using his advantage to attack his weakness, and the other was adept at surprise attacks and loved to fight to the death. There was also Yuanzhou General Yi Xiufeng, known as Nanjiang King Mingyang. He was good at defending the city and was famous in the south. Hezhou General Yang Yu was good at surprise attacks. He used infantry as cavalry. All of these people were talented and difficult to tame generals. However, their limelight and sharpness had always been covered by the Bailiang cavalry. The number of times these people were mentioned in the capital of Liang might not be as many as Chu Lushan or Yan Wenwan. However, there was one exception, and that was Nanjiang's number 1 general, Wu Zhongshuan. This old general not only commanded half of the soldiers and horses in the north of Nanjiang, but he also had the only cavalry in Nanjiang. At that time, His Royal Highness Zhao Zhu led thousands of cavalry to Guangling to help the king quell the rebellion. To be precise, he borrowed part of the soldiers and horses from Wu Zhongshuan. Wu Zhongshuan and Nalin Yusi became Zhao Bing's left and right arms. However, compared to Nalin Yusi, who was almost blindly trusted by the king of Yanqi, Wu Zhongshuan, who commanded the troops outside, paled in comparison. Among his 3 sons, the eldest and youngest were left in the territory under the jurisdiction of the king of Yanqi. Only one son, born of a concubine, followed by this old man. He also did not join the army. He ate, drank, whored and gambled and was the leader of the northern part of Nanjiang. It was rumored that once he took advantage of the opportunity when his father was patrolling the northern border to sneak into the south with more than 100 elite private retainers to show off. In the end, he was beaten to a pulp by His Royal Highness. That was not all. After he was beaten silly, no one knew who came up with the bad idea, but he actually went to the king's mansion to make a scene. After everything calmed down, outsiders did not know the inside story. Nanjiang only knew that the king of Yanqi's 3rd son, Zhao Yu, who held an important position in the army in the north, was recalled to the south. In any case, since then Wu Zhongshuan rarely returned to the south. He wholeheartedly guarded the northern part of Nanjiang. A group of more than 20 riders stopped their horses and raised their whips on the south bank of Guangling River. They looked at the rolling river flowing east, like the most spectacular white silk in the world undulating with the wind. There was a large age gap between these riders, but they were all wearing armor and carrying swords. Their vigorous spirit was extremely eye-catching. The few riders in the middle had a kind of vigorous spirit condensed from being in a superior position for a long time. The white-haired old man with a straight back was the most eye-catching. The old man held the whip made of tiger bone and the whip made of tiger skin. He narrowed his eyes and looked across the river straight to the north bank. The two middle-aged generals beside the old man were his trusted subordinates that he had cultivated for 20 to 30 years. Tang He and Li Chunyu's reputation was slightly inferior to Zhang Dingyuan, Gu Ying and the others. However, if they really competed on the battlefield, the old man did not think that they would lose. Furthermore, Tang He and Li Chunyu were both born in the top noble families in the north of Nanjiang. They had a complicated marriage alliance. This meant that the old man had more connections in the Central Plains than the king of Yen, who was severely restricted by the laws of the vassal states. Tang He was a coarse-looking man. His face was full of sideburns and he did not have the time or thought to take care of them. A few strands of his beard were tangled together. He bent down and touched the muscular back of his warhorse. He complained, "Did the two vassals Zhao Yi and Zhao Sun come to an agreement beforehand? Why are they so arrogant? They are not willing to help us cross the river, using the excuse that they want to defeat Chao Chongqing's navy to ensure our safety." The old man was the #1 general of Nanjiang, Wu Zhongshuan. He said calmly, "This logic makes sense. 100,000 soldiers crossing the river is not a small matter." Tang He said carelessly, "Chao Chongqing has made it clear that he has shrunk the battle line and concentrated his troops at Bailu Lake. Then we can go to Longmen Ferry and have the Qingzhou Navy protect us. Does the Zhao Yi Navy lack these 10 days to half a month? Otherwise we can cross the river from the estuary of Guangling. Chao Chongqing's warships can't climb onto the shore, go around the Zhao Yi Navy and then jump into the river to stop us, right? These bastards just don't want to see our Nanjiang elite troops successfully cross the river." Wu Zhongshuan shook his head and said, "This is the intention of the capital. Do you think Zhao Yi and Zhao Sun can make the decision?" Tang He's face was full of sarcasm. He laughed out loud and said, "For a vassal to act like this, you can be considered capable." Wu Zhongshuan had always had a cold personality. He had spent most of his life in the military. No matter if it was a great victory or a crushing defeat, he had always had an attitude that showed neither sorrow nor joy. He had become the perfect example of the saying in military books, "A person with a thunderous heart but a face as calm as a lake can be worshipped as a general." Wu Zhongshuan sank into deep thought. Compared to the generals around him who were mostly brave on the battlefield but not familiar with the court as a general, the old man's thoughts were more complicated. This time he was leading his troops north. Was it not a huge gamble? Other than official business, the old man also had a private matter to attend to. Someone wanted him to take care of a young man in Wu City called Jiang Fuding. In exchange, that person promised him that not only would he become the main general of the Nanjiang army on the northern expedition, after crossing Guangling, there would be a great wealth waiting for him. Wu Zhongshuan had no chance to refuse this matter because that person had exposed the mastermind behind Wu Zhongshuan's rise to fame, Huang Sanjia. Regarding this secret, not to mention his 3 disappointing sons, Wu Zhongshuan didn't even tell his wife who had grown old with him about it. At this time another group of cavalry galloped over. Tang He, Li Chunyu and the others raised their eyes to look. Their expressions were somewhat strange. Wu Zhongshuan squeezed the horse's belly and urged it forward. On the horse's back he lightly cupped his fist to the heroic young man. "This general greets His Royal Highness." Chapter 1460. This young man who only had 5 or 6 retainers with him was the crown prince of Yanqi, Zhao Zhu. Compared to Wu Zhongshuan and his men who were clad in metal armor, Zhao Zhu was dressed in a brocade robe. If it were not for the common saber on his waist, he would be easily mistaken for a young master who was out traveling. Beside him were 2 personal bodyguards from the crown prince's mansion, as well as a few outsiders from the southern border, 1 man and 2 women. The man's attire was extremely strange. He had a monk's ring scar on his bald head, but he wore a Daoist robe. The slightly older woman was extremely beautiful. She looked like a beautiful woman in her early 30s. If it wasn't for the fact that her aura was extremely strong and intimidating, she would have died young in this chaotic world of war and on the banks of the Guangling River where the smoke of war was rising from all directions. The younger woman was tall and was clearly a woman from the northern lands. Her appearance was not that stunning, but she had a unique style. Tang He, Li Chunyu and the other generals had long heard of the half-monk, half-Taoist man and the woman who had appeared on the Rouge list 3 times. Gong Bonk, the disciple of Wang Xinji of the martial emperor city, and Linya, the great grandmaster of fist arts, were well-known figures in Jianghu. As for why these 2 people had attached themselves to His Royal Highness, they were too lazy to think about it. No matter what conflict Crown Prince Zhao Zhu had with their benefactor Wu Zhongshuan, the vast southern border would be filled with heartfelt admiration. His Royal Highness had joined the army at a young age and had killed almost 10 people in the land of the Berserk miasma. He had built countless fortresses of various sizes. Before the rise of the young man surnamed Su in Bailiang, the people of the southern border were incomparably proud. They liked to say to outsiders that they had produced the crown prince of the crown prince who was most proficient in both the pen and the sword. Zhao Zhu smiled brightly and returned a fist salute. "Thank you for your hard work, General." Wu Zhongshuan's mouth twitched. This was probably considered a smile. Zhao Zhu turned his head to look at the river and asked softly, "What is the movement between Zhao Sun and Zhao Yi?" Zhao Zhu was, after all, the commander-in-chief of the northern expedition in name. Wu Zhongshuan was only the deputy commander-in-chief, assisting His Royal Highness, who had disappointed Li Yang greatly. Wu Zhongshuan said in a low voice, "The Qingzhou Navy went east along the river. At the Wubo Lake Pass, Longdu and the west of Bailu Lake Zhuji, to block the return route. Furthermore, the Qingzhou Navy's division of the Navy is Zhao Sun. Qingzhou is definitely an expert who is guiding Zhao. As for Zhao Yi's half of the Guangling Navy on the vast Bailu Lake, the large warships are more powerful. Now that the ships are in formation, they are like cavalry on land. Chao Chongqing's West Chu Navy has few soldiers and small ships to begin with. Encountering such a formation, not only is it difficult to attack from the front and difficult to attack from the back, even their original advantage of being small and nimble has disappeared." Zhao Zhu nodded and seemed to ask casually, "In the late spring, what is the weather like at Bailu Lake? What is the wind direction?" Wu Zhongshuan was stunned. Not only was this old general who had never personally participated in a large naval battle, the other generals were also stumped. Linya, the female Wu Dao grandmaster who once carried a cauldron to smash the slow-moving sword that entered the city at Xianxia Valley, smiled and said, "The strategists of the Spring Snow House who have been living by the Guangling River all year round aren't all good-for-nothings." Zhao Zhu sighed and said, "Then now it all depends on whether Chao Chongqing can turn the tide with his strength alone." Gong Bonk rubbed his bald head. "It will be difficult. The best swordsman in the capital, Qi Jiajia, has arrived. Chai Qingshan of the Dongyue sword pool will also not be absent. It is said that the woman surnamed Xinyuan from Mount Hui will also help. In addition to Zhao Go, who has turned out in full force, killing Chao Chongqing is out of the question. But if we talk about blocking a few of them, it will not be difficult." Wu Zhongshuan's cavalry unit bid farewell and left. Zhao Zhu remained on the riverbank for a long time. He shook his head and lowered his head to look. The saber at his waist was tied with a thin string to a worn-out money pouch. His Royal Highness muttered to himself, "If there is a day when the country belongs to me, Zhao Zhu, and the Jianghu belongs to you, Su Fengnian, then it will not be in vain that we 2 brothers met at Dantong Pass." He reached out and grabbed the cloth pouch that he had sewn and mended many times. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "The one surnamed Su, no matter what difficulties you encounter, don't die. You are the only brother I will recognize in my life. Don't try to be a hero. If worst comes to worst, you can come to my place. You have to know that the little beggar who was so poor that his pocket could not even make a sound is now richer than anyone else." The northern barbarians saw beautiful silk, but they did not believe that it was made from silk spun by insects. The scholars of the Central Plains did not believe that there were yurts in the grasslands that could accommodate 1,000 people. The people of the world did not go to Guangling River, but they did not believe that there were large boats on the river that could accommodate 20,000 people. In the middle of Bailu Lake, a majestic ship that was 30 to 40 feet above the water's surface sailed alone on the lake. Looking at the direction of the ship's bow, it was heading toward the West Chu Navy. A large flag with the character Jiang flapped in the wind. A beautiful woman with a purple sword case on her back stood on the railing of the 3rd floor. Her clothes fluttered in the wind, making her look like a fairy. The surface of the lake was vast. Suddenly, a small boat appeared in the distance. It got closer and closer until it was a few hundred feet away from the ship. A woman in white sat at the bow of the boat. A red string was tied around her wrist and a wine pot was hanging. Behind her stood a person in a red robe with large sleeves. The woman with the sword on her back and the woman in white looked at each other at almost the same time. It was just a glance and they did not look at each other anymore. The world did not know that this meeting had been separated by a full 800 years. The woman in white Luo Yang retracted her gaze. She raised her head and drank a mouthful of wine. She smiled lazily and said, "After so many years I still find it annoying." On the other side, Jiang and I reached out and pressed down on the sword case. Only then did the sword in the case stop crying. In the big city of the west regions that stood thousands of miles above the yellow sand. When the sword was about to leave the city, the short man with a wooden face and long arms like an ape no longer suppressed the shockingly abundant qi in his body. His body suddenly expanded and only then did he return to his normal stature. The long sword rushed forward in a line. He reached out his palm and hit the tip of the first sword. He twisted his wrist. The thousands of flying swords in the line all flew in a circle. After the long sword that pierced through the thick city wall spun for a while, it blasted a hole as big as a basket on the city wall. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was charging forward, slammed his palm on the city wall. The whole city was in an uproar as if there was an earthquake. The 160 swords that went out of the city to welcome the guest were all shattered inch by inch. The 70 swords that were still connected with qi in the city were also shattered by Tuoba Bodhisattva's palm. Walking on the lonely street in the city, Su Fengyan waved his sleeve. The long sword changed into a thunder whip that was used by immortals to suppress otherworldly items. Purple lightning lingered around the long whip. The long whip fiercely slashed on the inner city wall. The qi knife cut through the wall like tofu and shot toward Tuoba Bodhisattva. The #1 martial artist in Beimang, who rarely fought for many years, strode forward and directly broke through the city wall. After entering the city, he grabbed the upstanding qi that looked like a long whip but was actually the essence of the sword will and tore it apart. His other hand slapped out casually. The broken pieces of the city wall that didn't have time to fall to the ground disappeared in a flash. Su Fengyan put 2 fingers together and gently drew. The long whip with purple qi that didn't weaken at all quickly bent and retracted. It smashed the huge rock that broke through the air. Under the whip, a bottomless ravine was torn out on the street. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's left foot stepped on the tip of the sword. The whole sword began to shake. Su Fengyan whispered, "Disperse." The remaining 700 flying swords seemed to have understood human nature. They acted on their own and danced wildly. After the movement there was silence. The 700 flying swords stopped in the air and formed a semicircular formation. The 700 flying swords pointed directly at Tuoba Bodhisattva on the ground. This stop was just a moment. The rain of swords fell rapidly. It was like a rainstorm falling from the sky. The violent crackling sounds were like raindrops the size of soybeans hitting the surface of an oil paper umbrella. Dust flew up on the street. Su Fengyan kicked Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest, telling him to leave the city from where he entered. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva rushed into the city again at a speed that was countless times faster than when he left the city. He punched Su Fengyan's right elbow that he raised to block. Then Su Fengyan's right fist and Tuoba Bodhisattva's left fist collided at the same time. Both of them only took 2 steps back. However, the tall buildings on their left and right had all collapsed. The streets near their feet were filled with swords that had fallen to the ground. Some were straight and some were slanted. After Tuoba Bodhisattva and Su Fengyan's fist collided again, they both took a step back and frowned. Because he realized that the 500 flying swords had sunk into the ground at the same time and disappeared. Ever since Su Fengyan started practicing saber martial arts, he had traveled through 2 Jianghu. In these years when he fought with his enemies to the death, he mostly borrowed other people's moves and rarely created his own moves. Today Su Fengyan not only wanted to gamble on victory and defeat, he also wanted to use this opportunity to return to the peak of another realm at the same height. Previously there was a sword in the world. After that there was a sword on the ground. After Su Fengyan took 3 steps back, a rolling earth dragon formed by flying swords broke out of the ground and pounced on Tuoba Bodhisattva. His momentum was strong, his strength was great, and his qi was long. It was not something that the one-line sword that had left the city could compare to. Tuoba Bodhisattva was actually forced out of the city. After this sword, Su Fengyan's state of mind also improved a little. He walked out of the city in a carefree manner. It was a pity that no one saw him. If the arrogant old man with the sheepskin fur coat was still alive, he would also cheer and applaud. If old Huang was still alive, he would definitely grin and give him a thumbs up with his missing front teeth. If some wanderer who had traveled the Jianghu with Su Fengyan with a wooden sword could also see this, he would most likely say some words of dissatisfaction, but in his heart he would be happier than anyone else. Su Fengyan looked into the distance. It was as if he was looking at the Jianghu. This Jianghu where there was only him and was somewhat lonely. Chapter 1461. Tuoba Bodhisattva was knocked out of the city by the rolling sword of the Earth Dragon. Su Fengyan was also knocked out of the city and temporarily took the initiative. It was like a Liangmang battle where Tuoba Bodhisattva attacked the city while Su Fengyan defended the city. In the end, Su Fengyan still forgot to bring 2 pots of wine. There were more than 1,000 swords in the city. After knocking Tuoba Bodhisattva out of the city again, there were only about 100 swords left. They formed 2 parallel circles around Su Fengyan like 2 snakes biting each other's tails. If Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to get close to Su Fengyan, he would have to cross these 2 moats. After Tuoba Bodhisattva stood still, he was not in a hurry to get back at him. His gaze followed the 2 sword circles as he patted the dust off his chest. After a while, Tuoba Bodhisattva stepped forward. At the same time, the sword river that was as tall as Su Fengyan's waist expanded. However, Su Fengyan looked above his head. The second sword river that was at the same height as his chest tilted and blocked in front of Su Fengyan. The next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's figure appeared above Su Fengyan's head. He opened his 5 fingers and accurately grasped the key sword that was the eye of the formation in the torrent of sword aura. When the long river of sword formation was slightly stagnant, Tuoba Bodhisattva took the opportunity to stab down. Su Fengyan had one hand behind his back and the other hand in front of him gently shook his sleeve. More than 40 flying swords appeared on the sword bodies like red snakes that were as thin as needles. When Tuoba Bodhisattva broke through the formation and stabbed down with his sword, Su Fengyan gently moved 2 steps to the right and controlled more than 40 flying swords to hover behind Tuoba Bodhisattva. Then he stretched out the hand behind him and dodged the attack. He pressed his palm on Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest, who had not yet landed on the ground, and pushed back with his palm, pushing Tuoba Bodhisattva more than 10 feet away. During this time, Tuoba Bodhisattva's back kept colliding with more than 40 sharp swords. The sound of the flying swords shattering was like a landslide, and the red snakes that coiled around the swords turned into fine powder. Since the beginning of the battle, Su Fengyan, who had the upper hand, did not have the slightest complacency on his face. In his field of vision, the tall man who had been pushed back 3 times in a row still had his clothes intact. It should be known that he had almost used brute force to withstand the one-line sword, the earth sword, and the last push of more than 50 flying swords. This meant that his 3 consecutive sword chi had not broken through the man's gang chi. Of course, Su Fengyan was also far from being at the stage where he was going all out. Both of them seemed to be cautiously and reserved, testing their skills. Since they did not have the confidence to kill in one blow, they would slowly grind it out. It was just that when ordinary martial artists tested each other in the arena, both of them liked to go around in circles and would not punch for a long time. As one of the 4 great grandmasters, Su Fengyan and Tuoba's small test of their skills should be shocking to the world. Bodhisattva Tuoba was still holding onto the sword that belonged to an unknown swordsman in the city. He lowered his head and looked at it. There were red threads circling around the sword. It was the floating sword aura left behind by Su Fengyan. It was also the unique supreme art of the mysterious finger-killing celestial phenomenon from Handiao Temple in Liyang. Tuoba slightly increased the strength of his 5 fingers holding the sword. The tiny red snakes parasitized on the sword trembled for a while before disappearing in a puff of smoke in an instant. Tuoba did not break the sword directly. Instead, he gently tossed it back to Su Fengyan. This silent action was extremely conceited. You Su Fengyan have crossed paths with the 2 sword gods of Liyang, Li Chungang and Dongtai. Now that both sword will and sword art can be said to be one of the best in the world, then you can show it to your heart's content. Tuoba will take it all. Su Fengyan did not make any move. After dispersing the 2 sword rivers, more than 100 swords fell in the distance around the 2 of them. They just happened to be inserted into the ground in a big circle like a thunder pool. In front of Su Fengyan, only the sword that Tuoba had tossed over was left. It hovered on one side of his shoulder, the tip of the sword pointing directly at Tuoba. Tuoba twitched the corner of his mouth. Finally, you are no longer using chi to control the sword. Is it finally worthy for you to hold the sword with your own hands? What an arrogant attitude. Su Fengyan smiled and raised his arm to hold the sword. However, he did not make any reasonable sword movements. Instead, he had already pulled out the sword when he held it. The sword chi burst forth and the spirit reached the rainbow. A wisp of sword chi as thick as a dragon's waist rushed toward Tuoba's face. The latter opened his 5 fingers and casually patted on the aggressive sword chi. The vigorous sword chi exploded in front of him and it was incomparably brilliant. In an instant, both of Bodhisattva Tuoba's feet were rooted to the ground. His body tilted to the right as though he was about to fall but didn't. A ray of light and shadow flashed past his heart where he originally stood, and a thunderous boom erupted 1,000 feet away. It turned out that Su Fengyan had tossed out the sword. He was the bow and the sword was the arrow. At that time, before Su Fengyan rushed to the west of Qingcang City to fight with the sword chi, Lu Gui's army had once used ballistas and huge arrows to block the purple chi from the east. The arrows were said to have the monstrous power of sword immortal. When he was young, he read a poem that said, "It's better to get the form than the momentum, and it's better to get the momentum than the rhythm." Therefore, there was a saying that the spirit could be written with the form to be vivid. Su Fengyan naturally did not reach the realm of Confucian sage. However, after meeting Xianyuan Jingqing, Chao Chongqing and Xia Guanying, he had long understood a truth. The book not only contained the Yen Ryu's golden house, but also the celestial state. When Tuoba dodged the arrow, he went to the edge of the thunder pool and quickly pulled out a sword from the ground. He swung his arm and drew a semicircle. Then he threw another sword at Tuoba. The power of the arrow was comparable to the Earth Immortal's sword. Although the momentum and force were slightly inferior, it could not withstand the speed and frequency of Su Fengyan's sword. Regardless of whether the arrow missed or whether Tuoba dodged, Su Fengyan was like a diligent old farmer who was harvesting crops in autumn. He pulled out his sword one by one, drew a semicircle with his arm and shot out arrows one after another. Su Fengyan knew the root of the problem. This was just a rough immortal's flying sword. It could not be used to take a head from 1,000 miles away. To deal with Tuoba, if he wanted to cause a certain amount of damage, it could not exceed 800 feet. The center of the thunder pool where Tuoba was just within the range of this attack. Since Bodhisattva Tuoba had shown that he was willing to be the target, Su Fengyan did not mind at all to let this guy fail miserably at such an easy task. More than 100 immortals' flying swords were strung together like a string of arrows. As expected, Tuoba did not deliberately leave the thunder pool. After dodging more than 60 Earth Immortals' flying swords, he was probably a little angry. After that, more than 30 flying swords that were as fast as lightning were mostly smashed by his fists. However, the last 2 swords were only smashed by him. Su Fengyan also used up all his arrows in one breath. The two people's positions did not change. Su Fengyan still had his back to the city and Tuoba still faced the city gate. Su Fengyan's right arm that had thrown away the sword trembled slightly, but he did not rub it. It was not that he did not want to, but that he could not. He changed his chi at the same time as Bodhisattva Tuoba. However, although the timing of their chi was exactly the same, Bodhisattva Tuoba was still faster than Su Fengyan by a hair's breadth. The seemingly negligible hair's breadth was often the difference between life and death in a fight between great grandmasters. Chapter 1462. When a martial artist ascended to the celestial state, it was like a giant ladder resonating with heaven and earth. It was also like a river connecting to the sea. Logically speaking, as long as there was a chance to breathe, chi could be continuously absorbed from heaven and earth. This was the real reason why there was a saying in the ancient book, "As long as the saint is alive, the thief will not stop." However, in a battle between celestial state and above, even if there was a chance to breathe and a person's state could transcend the mortal world, he was still a mortal with a 7-foot body. After all, there was a limit to the accumulation of energy in the body. Usually there would be excess energy to replenish. This was also why Su Fengyan used the secret flying sword technique of the Wu family's sword tomb. He wanted to use his own will to exchange for Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi and physical strength. However, it was a pity that the speed of Tuoba Bodhisattva's first breath was still faster than his. He had created more than 100 fairy swords with the addition of his 4th sword grip. Su Fengyan quickly raised his arm and blocked his forehead with his elbow. The next moment he was knocked against the city wall. He did not lean against the tall city wall with his back. Instead he changed his posture in the process of flying. His feet landed on the ground. After touching the wall he quickly bent to reduce the force. Su Fengyan squatted on the wall. Under his feet was the wall that was cracked like a spider web. Su Fengyan did not retreat. He suddenly straightened his legs and shot towards Tuoba Bodhisattva. Then Su Fengyan was punched back to the city wall by Tuoba Bodhisattva. His whole body was embedded in the wall. This majestic city in the western regions was like an old man past his prime. In the end there were thunderstorms and torrential rain above his head without rest. Even though he had weathered many hardships, it was inevitable that his life would be hanging by a thread. Fortunately, the two culprits who were the ultimate martial artists of the world finally let it go and left the city. However, this sudden storm had already woken up all the people in the city. Many busybodies who were not afraid of death followed the sound and rushed to the city wall. However, when the boldest group of people tried to climb up the city wall to take a closer look, they were knocked to the ground by an invisible and majestic chi. 4 or 5 people who were not skilled in martial arts and did not have enough internal energy were knocked to the ground. Blood burst out from their bodies and they died on the spot, lying in a pool of blood. As for the rest of the fellows who were lucky enough to survive, they only wished that their parents hadn't given them an extra pair of legs. They didn't even bother to wipe off the scarlet blood that continuously flowed out from their 7 orifices as they fled back into the city. They only wanted to get as far away from the gates of hell as possible. This group of people ran through the night streets with their faces covered in blood like malicious ghosts, scaring the busybodies behind them into quickly dispelling any thoughts of joining in on the fun. Then these miserable fellows suddenly heard a whistling sound above their heads. Under the strong wind, all of them were lifted off the ground and fell heavily to the ground. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. It was not easy for ordinary people to watch such a fight between immortals. Even if they wanted to clap their hands and cheer from the other side, it would depend on whether they had the luck to do so. It turned out that after Su Fengyan had sunk into the wall, Tuoba Bodhisattva had completely smashed the thick wall out of it. After Tuoba Bodhisattva entered the city, he slowed down his footsteps. If Bailiang wanted to guard the city gate for the central plains, then obediently lock yourself in the gate. How dare you go out of the city to fight? Did you really think that Bailiang's million-strong army was weak? Did Su Fengyan really think that Tuoba Bodhisattva had the heart of a bodhisattva? Wang Xinji cared about the survival of the Jianghu, but Tuoba Bodhisattva was never a Jianghu person. Why would I care if Su Fengyan could continue the Jianghu's life? Tuoba Bodhisattva looked into the distance and finally opened his mouth. He asked in a low voice, "The 1,000 swords have been used up. Do you want to continue borrowing swords? Or do you want to change your blade and start again? If you can use Gu Jintong's Thunder of Mind or Spring and Autumn Saber Armor Qi Lianhua's moves, I don't mind waiting for you for a while to let you take another breath." It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to use Su Fengyan, who was a great master of the Liang Wulin, to challenge the entire Liang Jianghu. That was why he was so patient and took the beating. Su Fengyan stopped at the city gate between the outer city and the inner city. Not only were his sleeves fluttering in the wind and rain, but his entire robe was fluttering in the wind and rain. It seemed to have offset Tuoba Bodhisattva's fist aura and did not hurt his body. Tuoba Bodhisattva's voice was not loud, but the eardrums of everyone in the inner and outer city were vibrating. Every word entered their ears even if they covered their ears. It was futile. A flash of white light rushed over from Mount Lontua. She happened to hear Tuoba Bodhisattva's words outside the city. It was the 6-pearl Bodhisattva. Her face was pale. She did not dare to delay for a moment and only took 2 breaths. At this moment she suddenly stood still and threw a sword high up in her hand. She wanted to hand it over to the young man who was as bright as a firefly in the night sky of the western region. However, she was already at the end of her rope and could not control the sword after throwing it. She did not throw it to Su Fengyan's side but instead nailed it to the top of the inner city wall behind Su Fengyan with a distorted trajectory. As for the other saber in her hand, she could not throw it out for the time being with a pale face. Su Fengyan turned his head to look at the ancient sword, Loudness, that was forged in the Dafeng dynasty and was lost in thought. For some reason he thought of the cicadas that he heard in Wutong'an when he was young. Later on he heard the cicadas for the first time when he traveled in Jianghu before he turned 20. There was also the last time he heard the cicadas when he brought wine to the tide-listening pavilion when his master Li Yishan was still alive. The autumn wind was chilling and the cicadas were mournful on the high branches. The first level the world thought it was noisy. The second level the world thought it was sad. The third level the world sang songs of admiration and loudness for the world. Another day there was another person who had said something heroic to him under a tree with a grin on his face. If one day you are in Jianghu and hear of a peerless swordsman with the surname Wen, there is no doubt that it is me. Su Fengyan did not take down the famous sword, Loudness. Instead he laughed loudly and said, "If anyone in the city has a wooden sword, please raise it high." In the city, there was a girl named Sima Tiaha who happened to be tidying up the family's storehouse. There were a few narrow wooden swords that she used to practice swordsmanship when she was young. When she heard this somewhat familiar voice, she subconsciously grabbed one of the wooden swords and raised it high. She did not care if that person could hear her and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Here! Here!" The next moment the wooden sword seemed to have a life of its own. It broke through the roof and flew out of her hand. The dumbfounded girl muttered, "Mother did not lie to me. It really was you." Then the girl was somewhat resentful, "But at that time I really did not look handsome." Su Fengyan held the wooden sword and walked towards Tuoba Bodhisattva. "The world is full of melancholy, the world is not happy. What harm is there? I have the pleasure sword." Su Fengyan's face was full of smiles. "Brother, you turned around and left Jianghu. Whether you are willing or not, I will walk a part of it for you." This night at this moment the entire city only heard one sentence. "Tuoba Bodhisattva. I Su Fengyan have a sword that I learned from the swordsman of the Central Plains, Wen Hua. This sword, please leave the city." They had never heard of some Wen Hua, they did not even know about Liang River Lake. However, the king of Bailiang, Su Fengyan, and Beimang's god of war, Tuoba Bodhisattva, these two great names were certainly like thunder in their ears. Then, if Su Fengyan really forced Tuoba Bodhisattva to leave the city with one sword, that swordsman called Wen Hua should be quite amazing, right? Chapter 1463. Facing Tuoba Bodhisattva, Su Fengyan held the inconspicuous wooden sword and waved it gently. This was a stance used by many swordsmen in the world. Even a fledgling swordsman who had just held a 3-foot sword for the first time could use it. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression was more serious than when he faced the magnificent 4 swords earlier. Su Fengyan took half a step forward with his left foot, followed by 1 step with his right foot. Then his left foot took the distance of 2 steps and his right foot took the distance of 4 steps and so on. Su Fengyan's steps became bigger and bigger, and the last step was like a long sweep across the sky. This was the same move used by Lu Haosher, the gatekeeper of Great Peace City, to attack the white-robed Luo Yang. However, the wooden sword was still the same wooden sword. It did not contain any profound sword will, nor did it emit any sword aura. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who did not move, could not help but show a puzzled expression. Of course, he did not think that Su Fengyan was bluffing. This person was still far from being exhausted. Therefore, when Su Fengyan rushed to Tuoba Bodhisattva with the sword in one hand, this was also the first time that Su Fengyan, who played to his strengths and avoided his weaknesses after tonight's battle, took the initiative to engage in close combat. Tuoba Bodhisattva retreating hundreds of feet. His gaze was not on Su Fengyan, but on the simple wooden sword that Su Fengyan held in his hand like a horse dragging a spear. Tuoba Bodhisattva was waiting for Su Fengyan to make a move. When he really raised his sword, there was no perfect move in the world and Wang Xianji was no exception. However, Wang Xianji's strong physique and strong will made him the undisputed #1 person in the world. Wang Xianji could use a simple punch to defeat all his opponents. It was not because of how brilliant his moves were. Wang Xianji did not care about fancy moves, it was because he wanted to crush his opponents. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not think that Su Fengyan, who was badly injured, had the ability to do so. Otherwise he would not have schemed so much after the battle. Tuoba Bodhisattva was confident that as long as Su Fengyan used his sword, he would be able to break it. The only difference was that he would need to spend some effort. Today in Liang and Beimang, the only sword that could force Tuoba Bodhisattva to avoid was the sword of the Peach Blossom Sword God of Sword Dong Tai. Even if Su Fengyan had mastered all kinds of sword moves through a comprehensive study, turning something rotten into something magical and reaching the pinnacle of swordsmanship, he still hadn't completely reached the position where Li Chungang once stood and where Deng Taya stood today. If Su Fengyan had reached the level of Lu Dongxian, the first person in 1,000 years, Tuoba Bodhisattva would not have come to this city to humiliate himself. Tuoba Bodhisattva walked leisurely and allowed Su Fengyan to approach him with his sword. He retreated again and again. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's bottom line was clear. He would not leave the city. Before the city gate, as long as Su Fengyan did not use his sword, he would not attack. Tuoba Bodhisattva patiently waited for his opponent to reveal what Su Fengyan had up his sleeve. During this time, Tuoba Bodhisattva was still paying attention to the wooden sword. It was not that Tuoba Bodhisattva could not attack immediately after Su Fengyan spoke. However, the more Su Fengyan held the sword, the more he looked like an incompetent swordsman who had just stepped into Jianghu. Tuoba Bodhisattva was naturally more curious. Even after Su Fengyan had taken 16 steps, he still did not sense the slightest Grandmaster's aura from the wooden sword. As a result, Tuoba Bodhisattva could not help but think. Could it be that this sword was just for show from the beginning to the end? Was it just to help the swordsman from the Central Plains named Wenhua become famous in the western region and spread the word? Or could it be that Su Fengyan was playing some boring trick of having the sword in his hand but not the sword in his heart? The reason why Tuoba Bodhisattva could hold back his temper and not attack was because he wanted to pave the way for the inevitable second battle between himself and Dong Tai in the future. The more Su Fengyan used his sword, the greater Tuoba Bodhisattva's chances of winning. In Beimang, it was an indisputable fact that the way of the sword had withered. How could a loftier sword energy satisfy Tuoba Bodhisattva's appetite? Before leaving the city, Tuoba Bodhisattva still had 2 chances to retreat. However, Su Fengyan still had no intention of using his sword. This made Tuoba Bodhisattva vaguely angry. Could it be that this Su Fengyan relied on a broken wooden sword that did not even have a scabbard to scare him out of the city? Therefore, Tuoba Bodhisattva no longer showed weakness and retreated step by step. The tip of his right foot took root on the ground of the street. With a heavy twist, he crushed the stone floor. His left foot suddenly stepped forward. Before the sole of his foot touched the ground, the entire street in front of Tuoba Bodhisattva collapsed. When his left foot stepped down and his right fist punched out, the buildings and houses on both sides of the main street were like wheat fields blown by a strong wind. Thousands of wheat ears could not bear the heavy burden and all fell in the same direction. This strong wind spread throughout the main street, lifting countless pieces of gravel and rushing towards Su Fengyan. Su Fengyan was like a traveler who was traveling against the wind. Since he could not avoid the wind, he would bite the bullet and pass through it. With every step he took, cracks began to appear on his undamaged robe even though it was covered by countless floating scarlet snakes. His black hair fluttered wildly in the wind, and even one side of his face was instantly cut open by the fist aura, leaving small bloody grooves. Tuoba Bodhisattva's heart trembled. This guy actually wanted to shorten the distance by taking the fist aura head-on just to accumulate power for that sword. In the end, when both sides were only one step away from each other, the winner would be decided? Or perhaps his ambition was even greater. All the previous stingy calculations of a small businessman were all a smokescreen. In fact, he had been lying in ambush all along. Did he want this sword to decide life and death? Previously, there were 2 swords that were separated into under the heavens and on the earth. Later, there were the dazzling 100 swords of the earth immortal that were separated into inner and outer distance. Until now, there had been no signs of this still sword. Could it be that he would only stop after deciding life and death? Just as he expected, the wooden sword in Su Fengyan's hand pointed towards the ground. Generally speaking, the truth of the world could not escape the 4 words of neutrality and peace. If it was simplified, it would probably be the doctrine of the mean that Confucianism advocated. Buddhism had no self, Taoism had no action. It was probably the same with different approaches to achieve the same result. However, at this moment Tuoba Bodhisattva saw the complicated and turbulent will of this wooden sword that was twisted but still did not release any sword aura. Unwillingness, depression, resentment, grief. I feel very unjust in my heart. Su Fengyan casually raised the wooden sword and pointed the sword at Tuoba Bodhisattva. There was no reason to speak of. The man and the sword collided directly with each other in an extremely illogical manner. This wooden sword had the meaning of the Jianghu. Resolute and resolute. It was like a crazy gambler who had taken out his life savings and spent a lot of money to decide victory and defeat with God. Chapter 1464. Many years ago, there was a rich young man who was full of ambition for the first time in Jianghu. Unfortunately, it could not be considered a leisurely journey. He did not meet any fairy with fluttering clothes, nor did he meet any chivalrous heroes. He could only be considered to be at the bottom of Jianghu, which was like a rotten quagmire. Even 3 meals a day were a problem. That Jianghu trip was a complete mess. Then he met a wooden sword ranger who sympathized with him. It could be said that no discord, no concord. When he was stealing melons, he met a fellow traveler. At first, both of them were scared half to death. After that, they became companions. Relying on the knowledge he had accumulated at home in his early years, he always liked to use some of the great principles he had read in books or heard from others to poke at the narrow-minded and shabby ranger. His words seemed to be sincere, but in reality he mischievously told the guy who always liked to use his clothes to carefully wipe his wooden sword that all the famous swordsmen in the world valued their swords. However, that kind of value in the final analysis was because of the sword intent that extended from the 3-foot-long sword in the hand. Which first-class swordsman valued the sword more than the person? If that guy really could not refute, he would only say, "That's someone else's sword. It's none of your business. It's not mine." If he was really forced, he would become angry out of humiliation and hold the wooden sword, threatening, "Do you really think that I don't have a few trump cards in Jianghu?" He would often provoke him by saying, "Come at me if you have the ability." In the end, he would definitely be chased by that guy with the wooden sword. He would say things like, "Monkey plucks peach, black tiger plucks heart," and so on. In fact, he was just using the wooden sword to scare people. What really annoyed him was that there were several times when he was squatting on the ground in the wilderness, to his heart's content. That guy would always jump out at the wrong time and say that he wanted to show him a new set of peerless swordsmanship. As long as he did not praise people until his mouth was dry, that bastard who took advantage of people's difficulties would definitely not stop practicing his swordsmanship. That time when they traveled the Jianghu together, in short, it was during the martial arts competition for a spouse. That guy had rushed up to the arena in high spirits and was beaten down dejectedly. After that, not only did he have to carry that guy out of the arena amidst laughter and rolling eyes, he also had to be responsible for being that guy's practice target. Only then could that bastard who was determined to become the world's #1 swordsman regain his composure and continue to be in high spirits. Then he would go to other places to be beaten. That guy had too many small problems. When he met Gu Liang, who fell in love with him at first sight, he always had to pretend to be her study companion. He always had to lie that the scrawny horse was his mount. If he asked the village women for a few bowls of water to quench his thirst, that guy with a smoking throat would not have the consciousness to repay the kindness of a drop of water. On the contrary, he might even burn the bridge after crossing the river. When he risked his body to be taken advantage of by the village women, he would loudly ask if the man in the house was dead. If he was not dead, he would quickly come out to see the wild man stealing his wife. There were several times when they were almost beaten to death by groups of farmers carrying hoes in the village. Every time he was humiliated or tactfully rejected by the woman he liked, that guy would lose his soul and lie on the ground like a corpse. He did not know whether that guy was heartbroken or not. Anyway, as a spectator, he was really tired. 1 or 2 times was fine, but why didn't he learn his lesson after 17 or 18 times? You used king straw rope to hang a wooden sword on your waist. Every time you squatted by the water, you would ask me and old Huang if I was handsome or not. You would roll your eyes and nod helplessly when you saw us. Do you really think that you are handsome and suave? Those girls with big buttocks and big breasts you met halfway and made you drool had to cry and beg to marry you? In this day and age, young ladies who are slightly more well-off have discerning eyes. Do you think that just because you ride that inferior horse over there, you won't be able to see the miserable scene of your pair of tattered straw sandals exposing the toes of your tattered straw shoes? Those women would be able to tell how many copper coins you had in your pocket with just a quick glance, as if you were wasting money. Later they met a rich family, a young lady who liked to call herself a heroine. With great difficulty they were able to live lavishly for a period of time. Finally, they were able to eat proper food in a restaurant. They drank big bowls of wine and ate big chunks of meat. They lamented that their bodies reeked of alcohol and their mouths were greasy meat. This was the kind of life a hero should lead. Later, the girls squandered all the money and their days began to be tight again. They thought that you would be depressed for a long time, but they did not expect that you would eat the sour dried beans that you stole from the village's grain drying field. You also said that you tasted the long-lost meat aroma. There was no banquet in the world that lasted forever. First, you said a few words to the girl and gave her half a bag of copper coins that you had secretly saved. After that, you pretended to be a man. That night, you were so distressed that you could not sleep. She teased you and asked you if you wanted to come back. In the end, you angrily picked up the wooden sword and cut it. Finally, you squatted on the ground and sighed bitterly, saying that it was two different things. It was one thing to treat the girl as a friend and be willing to give her as much as she had. You generously squandered all your money. It was another thing to feel distressed. It was the same thing to have two different feelings. It was not contradictory. In the end, the two of them also had to part. That night, sitting on the stone steps of the ruined temple, the nameless wanderer hugged the wooden sword and said that he did not have any savings left. He only had the wooden sword. Even if he was a brother, he could not give the sword away because he would have to rely on it to make a living. He would have to make a name for himself and become one of the best swordsmen in the world. He also vowed that after he made a name for himself, he would definitely return what he owed in the past 2 years. He Wenhua did not have the habit of owing people. He joked that there was no need to return it. He did not expect it. The guy who had never gone to private school and had never read books still said the same thing. Brothers should settle accounts clearly. You gave without asking for anything in return, but I, Wenhua, would not really laugh and act as if nothing had happened. They were two different things. That time in the extremely destitute Jianghu, old Huang was not skilled at all. That little girl Li Yu dreamed of becoming a heroine even in her dreams. Wenhua, on the other hand, was a half-baked swordsman. However, many years later, Su Fengnian realized that it was like a jar of old wine. After drinking it, the aftertaste would always be there. That Jianghu, which was full of poor and destitute people, was much more memorable than the wonderful Jianghu that Su Fengnian yearned for when he was young. It was the kind of Jianghu where he could leap over roofs and vault over walls and step on snow without leaving a trace. It was a dark and windy night where he could kill people. Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression kept changing. How did Su Fengnian end this sword? Tuoba Bodhisattva snorted coldly and retreated out of the city. He originally wanted to enter the city quickly after Su Fengnian's unreasonable sword's momentum weakened from its peak. He wanted to return the favor on the spot with a thunderous momentum. At that moment, it would truly be a matter of life and death. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva was stunned on the spot. It was not because Su Fengnian had a backup plan. The sword's momentum was still rising steadily. It was the exact opposite. In the end, that sword only had Qiyun and not the slightest bit of sword energy. Su Fengnian stood still with his sword in his arms. He could not stop laughing. Wenhua, did you see that? Your Jianghu, your wooden sword, easily beat a master like Tuoba Bodhisattva out of the city. Su Fengnian inserted the wooden sword into the ground and raised his arms. The ancient sword Fang Sheng and the famous blade Qiyun flew from the hands of 6 jewel bodhisattva in the inner city and the outer city respectively. He held them gently. Su Fengnian stepped forward. Before he left the city, he turned his head and looked at the wooden sword. He laughed softly. Next, it's mine. The yellow sand of the desert spun for thousands of miles. Chapter 1465. The mountain range that traversed the western region like a giant sword cutting the western world in half had the reputation of being the ancestral mountain. All the dragon veins in the world originated from here. At a steep mountain pass that ran through the north and south of the western region, the mountains on both sides were dozens of meters high and the path was rugged and deep. This mountain gap was an important passage that connected the north and south of the western region. A caravan of merchants walked through it with difficulty, the sound of camel bells ringing. The merchants were dressed in tight-waisted clothes and sturdy leather boots. Mixed in with them were some women who wore hats to cover their faces. They were also tall and strong. There was a rumor in the Central Plains that the western regions liked to order women around like men and men around like livestock. These merchants traveling from the south to the north, regardless of whether they were men or women, all wore machetes at their waists. Some men with outstanding physical strength even hung a unique armor bag near the back of their camel humps. Inside the bag was a rough refined iron chain armor. When they encountered horse gang bandits, they could use camels to replace horses and fight in armor in case of accidents. Suddenly, the caravan was startled by a series of thunder-like sounds from afar. The caravan stopped abruptly and their faces changed dramatically. They mistakenly thought that they had run into a large group of horse gang who were waiting at the mountain pass. More than 50 people pulled out their machetes at the same time. The strong young man even quickly took out his iron armor from his armor bag and put it on. But in fact, everyone knew that if they really encountered horse gang who could create such a scene, they could only kill a few people with their poor combat strength. However, in the chaotic western region that had been without laws for more than 200 years, as long as there were horses and machetes, there would be people willing to work for them. Before the camels lined up neatly, someone with sharp eyes raised his head and saw a horrifying scene. A figure was running from the high cliff, like an eagle hunting for food on the ground. It fell diagonally and landed in front of everyone. After its feet touched the ground, it walked forward 7 or 8 steps due to inertia. It was only 10 steps away from the camel team. Everyone in the caravan was stunned. Some people swallowed subconsciously. They saw that the guy who fell from the sky had a different appearance from the people of the western region. He was young, handsome, and very clean. The young man carried a long sword in a white scabbard on his back and a machete on his waist. After taking a deep breath with dry lips, he raised his arm and made a gesture of drinking water. Then he asked with a smile in the common language of the western region, "Do you have water?" The camel team was silent, not knowing what to do. On the other hand, a woman wearing a hat took off a sheepskin pouch that still had some water left without hesitation and threw it high into the air to the man who looked like a mountain spirit. The young man with the sword and saber expressed his gratitude and quickly leaped out. After catching the water bag in the air, he looked back and grinned. He stepped on the air and turned his body, crashing into the cliff. Then he bent down slightly and used the momentum to rush forward. He continued to leap over roofs and vault over walls, like when he came. As he ran, he raised the water bag and drank a big gulp of water. After finishing it in one gulp, he casually threw it back, but it happened to land on the head of the woman in the bamboo hat. Just as the woman reached out to catch the water bag, a strong wind suddenly rose in front of the camel caravan. Another person fell from the sky like a falling rock. The strong wind blew and all the camels took a few steps back. The water bag missed the woman and fell lightly on the sand. Without waiting for the crowd to see the person's face clearly, he rose from the ground and disappeared in a flash. Many years later, a rumor about an immortal borrowing water spread throughout the western regions. Hundreds of miles to the south of the mountain range, near dusk, 2 separatist forces that had dominated the southern part of the western regions for many years fought fiercely over a woman whose beauty spread far and wide. Both sides had more than 2,000 horses and fought at the famous Emerald Lake in the western regions. It was said that after a young king of Bailiang became famous, the inferior party hoped to use the beautiful woman in their tribe to exchange for 300 sets of iron armor and 1,000 sets of bows from Bailiang, which was the best in the world, so they could dominate the southern part of the western regions. 700 cavalrymen were dispatched to escort the woman to Bailiang. Then they were intercepted at the Emerald Lake. After more than 2 hours of fierce fighting, the pursuers found out that the woman had already taken a detour and sneaked to Bailiang. They became angry out of humiliation and swore to kill the cunning tribe until the woman was the only one left. Without a man who could fight on horseback, they would see how they could rise in the desert. Just when the 2 sides were about to charge from horseback to dismount and fight, the whole battlefield was torn into 2 halves by a figure. Suddenly, people and horses were thrown off their feet. The front line that was cut open couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. They looked at each other and then at the same time at the guy who broke into the battlefield. They only saw that the man bent his knees, held the hilt of his sword with one hand and the tip of the sword with the other 2 fingers. The sword was held horizontally across his chest. The long sword was bent in a semicircle in front of him. After the dust settled, the long sword still maintained that strange arc and didn't return to its normal position. Another tall and sturdy figure passed through the gap in the battlefield and fiercely crashed into the sword-wielding man with unparalleled strength. The latter's 2 fingers on the tip of the sword rubbed along the body of the sword. The vigorous strength that refused to disperse after charging at the long sword rolled and condensed in the semicircle. Together with the infusion of his own chi, it finally formed a thunderball with purple lightning lingering around it. With a light flick of his wrist, he held the sword upside down to meet the enemy. The fist-sized purple lightning ball circled around the tip of the sword. When the tall and sturdy figure that seemed to be attached to the bone appeared 50 steps in front of him, the travel-worn but not dejected young swordsman smiled slightly. Instead of retreating, he advanced. Taya was held upside down and thunder was generated in the square inch. This sword had the style of holding the sword upside down, that Dong Tai relied on to become famous. It also had the power of Gu Jiantong's square-inch thunder. Tuoba Bodhisattva slapped away the purple lightning that was spinning from the tip of the sword to the hilt. At the same time he stretched out his hand to press on the hilt to prevent the momentum from increasing. He swept a whip kick towards Su Fingyan's neck. When the sword in Su Fingyan's hand was pushed away without any resistance, Tuoba Bodhisattva knew that this guy was up to something again. However, he did not believe that Su Fingyan, who defended more than he attacked, could set up a deadly trap. The whip kick swept out without any delay. Su Fingyan, who had let go of his sword, raised his elbow to block the powerful whip kick. With Tuoba Bodhisattva as the center, Su Fingyan was driven into a complete circle by the kick before he flew out of the circle. It seemed that Tuoba Bodhisattva had the upper hand. However, when Tuoba Bodhisattva's feet landed on the ground, Su Fingyan, who had already used his left hand to hold the hilt of the sword on his right waist while he was spinning, moved closer and closer. The sword was only half an inch out of its sheath. In that half an inch it shone brightly. The stunned spectators on the battlefield were blinded by the bright light. They could not stop crying even after they closed their eyes. Su Fingyan held the sword but was not in a hurry to pull it out completely. As he rushed forward, the distance between him and the sword increased by half an inch. The scattered light that was like the sun in the sky also converged. It was like water condensing into ice. Although all these changes were complicated, they happened in the blink of an eye between Su Fingyan's advance and retreat. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was calm and unruffled, narrowed his eyes and waited for Su Fingyan to pull out his sword after about 10 steps. Was Gu Jiantong's famous square-inch thunder finally coming? As for the purple lightning that was still moving behind him after he slapped it away, Tuoba Bodhisattva did not see it as a threat at all. This was because the speed of the purple lightning's movement was too slow compared to his body's movement. It was too slow. In all the martial arts in the world, as long as one was slower by a hair, it would be useless even if one had the power to topple mountains. Su Fingyan, who was holding the famous Dafeng blade Qiyun, closed in on him. Just as Tuoba Bodhisattva expected, he was about 10 steps away from him. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva was wrong about one thing. The square-inch thunder was not released when the sword was pulled out, but when the sword was sheathed again. Between the two of them, there was a sudden clap of thunder. Even if Tuoba Bodhisattva had the physique of a genuine Vajra realm, he did not dare to take the rolling thunder head-on. His palms were facing outwards and he raised them slightly to block most of the force. His body moved sideways with the momentum. Su Fingyan was directly facing the straight line. The sound of the tremors was endless. Hundreds of people on both sides were hit by the strong wind. In an instant they were uprooted from the ground and fell backward. After Tuoba Bodhisattva avoided the sharp edge, he almost instinctively circulated his chi dynamic 600 miles away to welcome Su Fingyan's true killer move. As expected, Su Fingyan's square-inch thunder was sheathed. The second stroke was a complete unsheathing of the sword. A dazzling white rainbow, like a flood dragon winding across the mountain range, pounced on Tuoba Bodhisattva. Tuoba Bodhisattva's one breath started half an hour ago. His chi was at its strongest. His punch had bent Su Fingyan's soundless sword in front of his chest, knocking Su Fingyan into the battlefield. Although his chi dynamic was inevitably weakened, it was still more than enough to destroy the white rainbow. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who wanted to achieve success with one punch, spared no effort. He bent his arm like a hammer. Not only did he smash the white rainbow, he even smashed the narrow saber. Su Fingyan was trying to exhaust Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi dynamic, waiting for the fleeting gap of breathing. Tuoba Bodhisattva was also waiting for Su Fingyan to exhaust his chi dynamic and take a breath. Therefore, his punch not only exhausted Su Fingyan's chi dynamic, but also forced Su Fingyan to take a breath of fresh chi as he retreated. However, Su Fingyan's response was unexpected. He was not like Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was staking everything. He chose to leave some leeway, allowing Tuoba Bodhisattva's punch to pass through the saber and hit his chest. Su Fingyan's body flew backward in the air like a butterfly. Just as he was about to crash into the ground, the tip of the narrow saber in his hand touched the ground lightly, stirring up a large handful of yellow sand. His body leaned back and his legs stumbled backward, facing Tuoba Bodhisattva. The old chi that had not been released after the previous inhalation dissipated completely. Then his lips moved slightly and he gently exhaled. To be precise, he was trying to complete the exhalation in one breath. Chapter 1466. Toba Bodhisattva sneered. He would not give Su Fengyin the chance to take a breath. Taking advantage of the short gap when Su Fengyin was taking a breath, he took a big step forward and punched with both fists. Although Toba Bodhisattva only had 30% of his strength left, if this punch hit, it would be much more effective than Su Fengyin, who took 120% of his strength when he was at his peak. It would be like hitting a snake's weak spot. This guy who was full of tricks would definitely spit out a big bowl of blood. Between heaven and earth, from birth to death, there was one thing that was easily overlooked, and that was breathing. One breath, one breath, one breath, and so on. It was done millions of times when one was awake, and it was done when one was asleep. The breathing technique of Taoism's longevity card was to return to simplicity. It was the most important thing to do in breathing. It was rare for a martial artist in the Vajra realm to kill a Xian finger master from the 3 sections. However, even if it happened, no one would be surprised. This was because the gap between the Vajra finger and Xian finger realms was not much of a gap. The threshold that was really difficult to cross was the celestial state. The reason why Han Diaozi was so famous in Liang Lake and was known as the first person below the land immortals was because of his Xian finger realm. He could fight and even kill a celestial state guru who breathed with heaven and earth. Toba Bodhisattva's eyes were stern. He shouted angrily and forced himself to take a breath. He stood still and his feet sank deep into the ground. His fists, which were originally aimed at Su Fengyin, hit each other and his chi increased sharply. It turned out that in the blink of an eye, Toba Bodhisattva was shocked to find that Su Fengyin's long sword, which had left his hand, coincidentally returned to its sheath as if it was pulled by an invisible chi when Su Fengyin stepped back to take a breath. At the same time, the slow, purple thunder that Toba Bodhisattva ignored also rushed to his back at a shocking speed. Su Fengyin's mouth was bleeding. He said silently, "Return home." The long sword on his back let out a long whistle in the sheath. It was like the last cry of an autumn cicada, singing to the world. It was like an old man who had left his hometown for many years and only wanted to die in his hometown. More than 1,000 people on the battlefield held their heads and covered their ears. They squatted on the ground, but they still could not reduce the sharp needle-like piercing pain in their eardrums. Behind Toba Bodhisattva, there seemed to be a purple golden lotus that was 20 feet tall, blooming with petals. Toba Bodhisattva had obviously underestimated the power of the sword returning to its scabbard. He felt as if he had been struck by a bell and had no choice but to take a step forward. His body leaned forward like a hunchback. Only then did he manage to dissipate the force of Toba Bodhisattva. Without expression. Bodhisattva. Toba Bodhisattva. Blood, blood, blood. Beimang's god of war. He was not surprised by the new move, nor was he angry because he was at a disadvantage. Along the way, Su Fengyin, who was slightly weaker in terms of chi-ji and physique, would use 1 or 2 unique skills that could be used by ordinary Wu Dao masters every time he took a breath. He would widen the distance between himself and the enemy so that he could take a breather. Toba Bodhisattva always thought that it should be the last surprise, but Su Fengyin was always able to pave the way for him when he was in a desperate situation. Li Chuangong's swordsmanship, Dong Tai's swordsmanship, Jian Huang, Lu Baijie and Huang Qing's sword moves, Wang Xinji's fists, Hong Shixiang's circle, Lu Haosher's celestial phenomenon, Han Xingxuan's finger mystery, Wang Zhongluo's finger mystery, scholars' chi, fairies' chi. There was no end, no end. This peak battle between the 4 great masters was a grindstone for each other to sharpen the highest martial arts. In the morning light, a black dot ran along the snow-covered mountain ridge to the peak, like a tiny mustard seed in the vast sea of snow. Carrying his sword and saber, he suddenly stopped. He squatted down and looked higher and farther. He casually grabbed a handful of snow and wiped his cheeks. His palm rubbed the stubble on his chin. After a moment of hesitation, he simply stretched out his hand and took out the spirited saber. Tilting his head, he used the shiny blade to shave his beard. Unlike the first 4 to 5 days of fighting and retreating, the situation between him and Toba Bodhisattva had turned around since the battle 2 nights ago. In 1 day and 2 nights they had fought 6 times. Toba Bodhisattva had taken the initiative to retreat 4 times. It was also different from the slow back and forth of the previous battle. Now one of them would choose to retreat if their attack failed. They did not want to fight a fierce battle but wanted to kill with one strike. After the monk in chicken soup gave him the Buddha bowl, Su Fengnian had been waiting for Tuoba Bodhisattva in the western region city like a fool. He wanted to borrow Tuoba Bodhisattva's fierce attacks to forge the sword embryo that he had absorbed. Both Tuoba Bodhisattva and Su Fengnian had gained something, but it was obvious that Su Fengnian was more likely to gain the upper hand after striking. After Su Fengnian's last ambush failed, he had pursued Tuoba Bodhisattva for more than 200 miles until both of them reached the top of this majestic snowy peak. In the battle of life and death, both of them had formed a certain tacit understanding. The one who retreated would not deliberately hide all of his chi activity. He would always leave some traces for the one who pursued to get to the bottom of it. Tuoba Bodhisattva had clearly told Su Fengnian that he would be waiting on this snowy peak. As for when and where he would launch his killing move without warning, it would depend on Su Fengnian's ability and luck. After Su Fengnian finished shaving his beard stubble, he put his knife back into its sheath. Before he stood up, he grabbed a handful of snow and put it into his mouth, letting it slowly melt and flow down his throat. Su Fengnian straightened his back. One hand went to his back to adjust the sword, the other hand pressed on the hilt and looked up. Suddenly heavy snow fell. The scale was getting bigger and bigger. It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva had created a huge avalanche with human strength. Su Fengnian was sure that Tuoba Bodhisattva would hide in the heavy snow. He closed his eyes and held the hilt with 4 fingers, his thumb pressed tightly on the hilt of the narrow saber, making the action of pulling the saber out of its sheath. The heavy snow fell from the top of the mountain like a flood, and then split up and passed by Su Fengnian on both sides. Su Fengnian was like a cornerstone, unmoving. Chapter 1467. An ice spear filled with chi was as fast as a rainbow as it pierced towards Su Fengnian's chest. Su Fengnian pushed out the narrow saber from the sheath and brushed past the spear and Tuoba Bodhisattva who was holding it. A piece of flesh was torn off Su Fengnian's shoulder, but a string of scarlet blood was left in the air beside Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian turned around. On the brink of death, there was no lingering fear in his heart. He only felt some regret. If Tuoba Bodhisattva had chosen this moment to decide the victor, Su Fengnian was confident that he could win with a heavy injury that could be temporarily suppressed. He could chop off an arm. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva gave up on this battlefield. He would rather use Su Fengnian's chi to cut a bloody groove on his back. After the avalanche, Su Fengnian sat cross-legged on the ground and panted heavily. He believed that Tuoba Bodhisattva would also be healing at the foot of the mountain. Now the two of them were no longer fighting over the speed of breathing. They were fighting to end the battle quickly, deciding life and death in one move. Su Fengnian lay lazily in the snow and looked at the sky. He muttered, "Life is as lonely as an avalanche." A large river cut through the canyon and passed through the vast mountain chain that stretched for 3,000 miles. It finally flowed into the sea in Nanzhao. Su Fengnian's forehead was poked by Tuoba Bodhisattva's finger when he was drinking water by the river. He crashed into the bottom of the river. Out of his 10 flying swords, 6 of them were only 1.5 inches away from piercing into Tuoba Bodhisattva's temples, eyes and heart. Tuoba Bodhisattva punched wildly on the river surface, staring at Su Fengnian who could not jump out of the water. He punched in the river, trying to kill Su Fengnian by suffocating him to death at the bottom of the river. Tuoba Bodhisattva walked on the river surface for a total of 120 miles. In the end, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who forcefully reversed his chi, not only had his arms droop down, but also blood flowed from his ears, nose and mouth. When Su Fengnian floated out of the water like a corpse, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who could no longer move his arms, could only step on him. Tuoba Bodhisattva knew that he would step on a flying sword controlled by Su Fengnian and his foot would be pierced by the flying sword, but he did not hesitate. Su Fengnian was stepped on in the chest and was once again stepped into the mud at the bottom of the river. For some reason, Tuoba Bodhisattva could not find Su Fengnian's corpse, nor could he find Su Fengnian's remaining aura. This young vassal king seemed to have evaporated from the human world. Just as Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had searched along the river for an entire night to no avail, was planning to return to the Liangmang border at dawn, Tuoba Bodhisattva saw the young man who refused to obediently report to the king of hell no matter what. He slowly walking out of the river's S. The long sword on his back was nowhere to be seen. He bit the scabbard with his mouth and held the sword with both hands. Both of them did not cross the river. Instead they slowly walked upstream. Su Fengyan was recuperating while Tuoba Bodhisattva was increasing his chances of winning. After nearly a decade of chasing and killing, both sides ran for thousands of miles. In a dark night with heavy rain that was rarely seen in the western region, they finally welcomed the final battle. It was a simple collision just like the charge of Liang Mang's cavalry. There was nothing fancy about it. Su Fengyan stabbed Tuoba Bodhisattva's abdomen with both hands. Tuoba Bodhisattva punched Su Fengyan's forehead as he retreated. In the end, Su Fengyan first let go of the sword in his hand. Then he held the sword with one hand. Then he pinched the sword with 2 fingers. In the end, he could only push the sword with 1 finger. When Su Fengyan completely let go of the sword, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had a hole in his abdomen, fell back heavily. Su Fengyan, whose hair was disheveled, fell straight back. Tuoba Bodhisattva lay in the mud. He stretched out a trembling hand. Since he could not hold the hilt, he directly held the blade and pulled it out from his abdomen. He used his other elbow to support himself and sat up with difficulty. Su Fengyan still did not move. Tuoba Bodhisattva felt relieved. He smiled and coughed up blood. He looked at the sword in his hand. What a pity. Tuoba Bodhisattva suddenly raised his head. He was stunned and his face was full of bitterness. A sword suddenly flew over and cut through the rain. It was the release sword. It was only at this moment that Tuoba Bodhisattva realized that the sword that had disappeared was actually waiting for this moment. It was waiting for the crucial moment when he, Tuoba Bodhisattva, seemed to have won. To do this, there had to be no deviation in time and place. In order to set up this trap, that person had to take a huge risk and split his attention to worry about the flying sword that was far away in the sky, before he attacked with his sword. Before that, he had to first guide the flying sword and then accurately kill him who was right in front of him. It was said that Li Yang's cat had died in this way. Tuoba Bodhisattva sighed softly. Originally, he only needed half an hour to recover and he could easily get rid of that young man. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not regret it too much. He just felt a little regretful and aggrieved. Was there enough time? There was no time. Who would have thought that there would be a day when Tuoba Bodhisattva placed his hopes on someone else? Tuoba Bodhisattva closed his eyes. Suddenly, an old man with a head full of snow stood in front of Tuoba Bodhisattva. He stretched out a finger and blocked the flying sword. The flying sword that could not take the head seemed to be wailing. It was extremely miserable. Su Fengyan, who was lying in the mud, maintained his last bit of clarity. He roughly guessed the identity of this person. The creator of Beimang's spider web, the Shadow Prime Minister Li Mibi. The old man smiled. You have to know that in order to stop Su Yanbing and Tantai Ningjing, this old man had to reach here first. We paid the price of more than 60 masters. In the future, the Beimang Jianghu can no longer be called Jianghu. The old man seemed to be exchanging pleasantries, but his movements did not stop at all. After breaking the flying sword, he went straight to Su Fengyan in the heavy rain and laughed. Su Fengyan, you have lost honorably. Moreover, you only lost to Tianming. Su Shao most likely won't blame you. At this moment, Su Fengyan only felt a splash of water by his ear. He did not know that a red sandalwood box had landed heavily near him. A young woman who had finally arrived after riding a sword for 6,000 miles did not look at Su Fengyan. She only said in a low voice, "You're not allowed to die." Chapter 1468. In the night, a man and a woman were walking towards a brightly lit city at the border of the western regions. However, the posture of the man and woman was a bit strange. The woman was carrying the man on her back while the man was carrying a purple box. Both the man and the woman's complexion were not good. Their faces were pale and yellow. It was as if they were in the same boat. The woman glanced at the city that was particularly eye-catching in the night and asked coldly, "Is this the sleepless city that you mentioned? Why do we have to come here? If we want to get rid of that old mad dog, there are many other options." The man's mouth twitched. He forced a smile and said, "This city is actually called Snow Lotus City. If we are lucky, there will be something we need in this city." The young woman with a terrible complexion but an outstanding appearance frowned and said, "Snow Lotus? Do you need it to treat your injuries?" There were too many descriptions to describe a woman's beauty. She was so beautiful that she could make the birds alight and beasts fall from the sky, outshine the moon and put the flowers to shame. She was so beautiful that she could cause the downfall of a nation. However, there was no description that could compare to the weight of these 4 words. Only one person in a generation had this kind of beauty. At this moment, this woman might be worthy of this description. Even if she was not the only one, she was at least one of the four. In terms of appearance, the woman and the man could be considered a good match. He did not explain further. Instead, he raised his head slightly and looked at the city that was full of music and dancing every night. Just as he was lost in thought, he suddenly felt a pain in his head. It turned out that her head had bumped into his head. He, who had suffered countless unexpected disasters, said angrily, "What now? When I woke up, you were the one who said that you wanted to carry me. I wrapped my arms around your neck and was about to be thrown a few feet away by you. Then I just gently held onto your shoulders and you threw me away. My hands could only shrink in front of my chest. I don't dare to put them anywhere. Do you still think I am being frivolous? Jiang and I. Why don't you just chop off my hands?" Previously, that fellow had inadvertently rubbed against her hair and made her feel itchy. Now it was this fellow's noisy voice that made her feel irritated. Without hesitation, she tilted her head again and the two heads collided fiercely. It was clearly a move to kill the enemy at the cost of 800. She hatefully said, "I want to chop you up and feed you to the dogs, but even the dogs don't want to eat you." He argued back ungracefully, "You are a dog. Otherwise, how do you know whether a dog will eat you or not?" Snow Lotus City was a small city located outside of the solitary mountain pass. It was located at the border between Nanzhao and Shishu in the western region. This city was famous for its residents who had been harvesting snow lotus flowers for generations. Among the 9 kingdoms of the spring and autumn period, not to mention Nanzhao and Shishu, which were close to the water, even the Liang imperial family, which was ridiculed as the barbarians of the north, would specially add snow lotus flowers as a first-class tribute. Nowadays, the value of snow lotus flowers was almost comparable to the value of gerfalcon in the Liao. The Snow Lotus City was named after the snow lotus. The joys and sorrows of the more than 3,000 local residents revolved around these snow-white plants. Over the past 30 years, these heavenly treasures had become increasingly rare. The appearance of almost every snow lotus would not only cause the Snow Lotus City to suddenly wake up like a dozing old man, causing the whole city to rejoice. Moreover, it would also cause the city to fall into a bloody storm with undercurrents. Find a place to rest? But that would require money, right? But they didn't. The guy said angrily, "Let's not talk about your ability to kill people. I think you are a sword immortal who can fly 1,000 miles with a sword. Even if you don't have enough money, what's wrong with staying in an inn? If anyone dares to ask you for money, you can take a sword and chop their 18 generations of ancestors until they are convinced. That's it. Do you see it? It's the one with the banner, 'You chew in.' If you don't have the face to eat and dash, I will reason with the innkeeper later." She suppressed her anger, but still followed his words and walked into the inn. The first floor was still full of drunkards. As soon as she stepped through the door, everyone turned to look at them. The woman is carrying the man and the man is carrying the box. The guy behind her added fuel to the fire. Stay. I want a good room." The shopkeeper was a bitter old man with slanted eyebrows. He was originally lying on the counter with sleepy eyes and yawning. When he saw the young man and woman in ragged clothes but with an extraordinary bearing, he glanced at them and was speechless in his heart. Just the red sandalwood box, which could be said to be a big treasure, was priceless. Why did this kind of people, who were destined to be rich and powerful, settle down in such a small temple? The bodhisattva was too big and the small temple could not accommodate them. The key point was that it was now a sensitive time when 2 snow lotuses appeared together. The old shopkeeper silently prayed for Buddha's blessing in his heart. He sighed, squeezed out a smile and personally walked around the counter to lead them to a secluded room on the 3rd floor. Without the old man's order, the waiter, who was usually lazier than a pig, brought the best tea for them. Squinting at the waiter's dazed eyes, the old man pulled him out of the room with all his strength. After bending over to close the door, he softly scolded, "You little brat's heart is too big. Do you think you can take a few glances at that fairy-like woman as you wish? Work hard, save money and honestly marry Xiao Mei from the wine shop next door. Then you can be content for the rest of your life." The waiter said with grief and indignation, "I won't lose any weight if I look at her more." The old innkeeper slapped the guy's head, "She won't lose any weight, but it's hard to say if you'll lose any weight, you little bastard. That woman looks weak, but she must be a martial artist." The young man's eyes lit up. "She looks so good and is from Jianghu. She can't be the famous purple bamboo fairy, right? Could it be that the purple bamboo knife is in the box? Hey, isn't it fitting that the purple bamboo knife is in the purple box? The old innkeeper put his hands behind his back and said with a self-deprecating face, "Don't think about it. Purple bamboo fairy has been General Lu's guest for a long time." The young man muttered in a low voice, "Speaking of which, it's strange. Why are there so many fairies and heroines with purple characters in their names now? Last year, Purple Bamboo Fairy and Purple Sword Fairy came to the city to buy snow lotuses, right?" The old innkeeper rolled his eyes and said, "God knows. If you have the ability, why don't you ask these fairies yourself?" Inside the room, she threw the guy onto the bed and put the red sandalwood sword box on the table. She sat on the chair and closed her eyes to rest. First, she rode the sword for thousands of miles from the misty Guangling Road to the desert of the western regions. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she had to experience a life-and-death battle with the old Beimang dog. After that, she had to carry the burden and flee for hundreds of miles. She had no time to rest, which made her body's qi flow extremely chaotic. There was a deep bloody wound on her neck that was so deep that her bones could be seen. She only needed to bandage it. If it wasn't for the fact that the old man named Li Mibi also needed to protect Tuoba Bodhisattva, she might not have been able to reach this city. Whether it was the old man with the sheepskin fur coat who taught her to practice calligraphy instead of swordsmanship, or Uncle Chow who was waiting for the imperial order, they all clearly explained the difference between the two. When she first met him in the torrential rain, she manipulated the rainwater and mud into several thousand swords, setting up 2 sword formations. Li Mibi still broke the sword formations effortlessly. During their escape, she did everything she could to turn everything into a 3-foot sword, but all along Li Mibi was strolling in the courtyard, following her like a shadow. The man was Su Fingyan, who survived the disaster. At this moment he was lying on the bed and said softly, "Although Li Mibi is only at the finger Xian level, his skills are somewhat similar to Catman Han Xian. He is invincible in the same level. As for the ordinary celestial level, it is difficult to suppress him. Otherwise he wouldn't be the ancestor of Beimang's spiderweb spy. However, don't be fooled by how easily he broke the sword formation and showed the style of a master. In fact, your sword formation made the old man tremble with fear. It's just that the old man is thick-skinned and you can't see it. If he didn't puff himself up at his own cost, he would have scared you into only defending and not attacking. If you killed Tuoba Bodhisattva, how would he sneak back to the Beimang Empress?" She sneered and said, "Are you blaming me?" She didn't expect a sharp rebuttal from the guy. Instead, she became even angrier and said angrily, "Someone didn't kill the opponent in one breath and almost had his head taken back to receive a reward. That's really amazing. No wonder he is one of the 4 great masters in the world." If I remember correctly, at that time the Jianghu people were talking about the new martial emperor after old Monster Wang. Someone paid someone to help talk nonsense in the Jianghu, right? Su Fingyan said weakly, "Please, the person who was almost killed by me at that time wasn't some weakling. He was Tuoba Bodhisattva. If Li Mibi didn't appear to mess things up, I would have swaggered to the Liangmang border and rode out alone. The head of their Beimang military god would be hanging on the tip of my spear, okay? Then the morale of Beimang would have fallen to the bottom. It would be more useful than killing 200,000 of their cavalry at the border. Simply put, 100,000 of our Beiliang people would have died less.